Hi, I'm Emily. I'll be your storyteller today. Many of you use these stories to fall asleep. So before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Also, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now get comfortable. Close your eyes and let the sound of the rain guide you into the story. The silence in the St. Jude's Annex wing wasn't just an absence of noise. It was a physical presence. It was a thick, heavy blanket, woven from decades of quiet suffering and sterile order. My name is Dr. Eris Thorne, and during my 3rd month of residency, I'd come to find a strange sort of peace in it. The main hospital, a mere sky bridge away, was a constant cacophony of life and death in equal, frantic measure. But here, in the annex, time seemed to slow, congealing around the low, rhythmic hum of life support machines and the gentle hiss of the ventilation system. My shoes, a pair of expensive orthopedic sneakers I'd bought to survive these 12-hour shifts, were the loudest thing in the wing. Each step was a soft, rubbery squeak against the polished linoleum, a sound that announced my lonely patrol to the sleeping and the inanimate alike. The annex was a relic, a section of the hospital from the 1960s kept operational for overflow and long-term stable patients. Tonight, we had only 2. Mr. Henderson in 302, a man lost in the fog of a post-operative state, and Mrs. Gable in 305, breathing with the steady aid of a ventilator, her chart thicker than a novel. The nurse's station was my island in this sea of quiet. It was a semi-circular desk of worn laminate, equipped with a bank of 4 grainy black and white security monitors and a single outdated computer. From here, I could see the main corridor stretching out in both directions. It's fluorescent, lights casting long, sterile shadows. It was a controlled environment, a place where science and procedure were meant to conquer the chaos of the human body. That sense of control was the bedrock of my sanity during these solitary nights, a belief in the order of things. My routine was a practiced ritual designed to ward off both boredom and error. At the top of every hour, I would do my rounds. I'd start with Mr. Henderson, checking his vitals, the drip of his IV, the color of his skin under the dim nightlight. I'd make a note on his chart, the scratch of my pen a small defiance against the overwhelming silence. His breathing was always even, a testament to the marvels of modern medicine, a life held in a delicate, automated balance. He never stirred, a silent partner in my nightly vigil. Then, I'd move to Mrs. Gable's room. Her situation was more precarious, the ventilator doing the work her own body had given up on. The machine was the true patient here. It'd screen a cascade of green and blue numbers I monitored with religious focus. I would check the tube connections, listen to the air exchange, and ensure that this fragile tether to life remained secure. Her room smelled of antiseptic and something vaguely floral from a long wilted bouquet on her windowsill, a ghost of a visitor from another time. After the rounds, I'd return to my station, the squeak of my shoes announcing my return to an empty audience. I'd spend the next 45 minutes reviewing patient files from the main hospital, preparing for the morning handoff, or studying for my upcoming board exams. The work was demanding, but it was predictable. It was a world of data, of cause and effect, where every anomaly had a logical scientific explanation. This illusion of certainty was a comfort, a shield against the primal fears that darkness and solitude can conjure. The annex itself felt like a living fossil. The architecture was stark and utilitarian, a product of an era that valued function over feeling. The walls were painted a pale, sterile green, a color that was supposed to be calming but instead felt vaguely institutional, like a memory of sadness. In some of the unused rooms, You could still see the ghostly outlines where crucifixes had once hung, remnants of the hospital's more overtly religious past. Those empty rooms were a void, a testament to the wing's slow decline. My only connection to the outside world was a pager clipped to my belt and a landline phone that hadn't rung in 3 weeks. The isolation was profound. The day staff were a distant memory, their cheerful morning chatter a world away from my nocturnal reality. Here, under the buzz of the fluorescent lights, I was the sole guardian, the only conscious mind in a wing that was, for all intents and purposes, asleep. I felt a sense of ownership, a strange pride in my solitary responsibility for this forgotten corner of the hospital. Tonight was no different from any other. The air was cool and still. The coffee in my thermos was growing lukewarm, and the pages of my textbook on cardiology felt heavy in my hands. I remember glancing at the clock on the computer screen. It read 2:15 a.m. This was the deepest part of the night, the so-called witching hour, though I'd always scoffed at the superstition. For me, it was simply the metabolic low point, the time when my body craved sleep the most and the silence felt its most absolute. I took a slow sip of my coffee, the bitter warmth a welcome jolt. I leaned back in my chair, the old springs groaning in protest, and surveyed my domain through the monitors. Monitor 1 showed the west corridor, empty. Monitor 2 showed the east corridor, also empty. Monitor 3 was a wide shot of the nurses' station, a grainy, monochrome version of myself sitting at the desk. Monitor 4 was aimed at the double doors of the sky bridge, the sealed passage to the bustling main building. All was quiet. All was secure. The patients were stable, their rhythmic breathing a soft, organic counterpoint to the electronic hums. Mr. Henderson was a gentle snorer, a sound so regular I'd come to find it reassuring. Mrs. Gable was silent, her presence defined only by the rise and fall of her chest in time with the ventilator's push. They were my charges, my responsibility, but they were also part of the scenery, as constant and predictable as the flickering light at the end of the hallway. I felt a sense of calm settle over me, the familiar comfort of a routine perfectly executed. There was no reason to suspect this night would be any different from the dozen that had preceded it. It was a place of healing, of order. The walls were thick, the doors were locked. The only people here were me and my two deeply unconscious patients. The feeling was one of complete and utter control, a predictable world that I understood. I remember tracing the faint crack in the laminate of the desk with my finger, a tiny branching fracture like a river delta. It was one of the many imperfections that made the annex feel real, grounded. The scuff marks on the walls, the slight sag in the ceiling tiles, the persistent buzz from the overhead light. These were the details of my world, the familiar textures of my solitary nights. They were the signs of a place that was old, yes, safe. My pager was silent on my hip. The phone hadn't made a sound. I was alone, but I was not lonely. There was a difference. Loneliness implied a longing for company, a lack. What I felt was a kind of focused solitude, a state of being entirely self-contained. The demands of the job required it, and I had adapted. My world had shrunk to the confines of this wing, and within these walls, I was the master of a very small, very quiet universe. I adjusted the angle of the desk lamp, casting a warmer, more focused pool of light on my textbook. The rest of the station was cast into a deeper gloom, making the security monitors seem brighter, like 4 small windows into a silent, monochrome world. The image of the empty corridors was hypnotic in its stillness. Nothing moved. Nothing changed. It was the perfect picture of a night shift in the quietest wing of the hospital. I felt a yawn building, a deep and satisfying stretch of my jaw. It was a reminder of my own biology, a simple human response to the late hour. I promised myself another 20 minutes of studying before I would allow myself a short break to walk the corridors again, to stretch my legs and ensure the predictable peace remained undisturbed. The thought was a comforting one, a plan for the immediate future in a place where the future was measured in minutes and hours. This was the normal. This was the baseline. A young doctor, 2 sleeping patients, and a building full of quiet, sterile air. The established order was the only thing that mattered. Every sound had a source, every event a cause. The squeak of my shoes, the hum of the machines, the soft snoring from room 302. It was a simple, understandable symphony of the night, one I had heard many times before. I had no reason to believe any new instruments would be joining the orchestra. The silence, as I said, was a presence, but it was a benign one, a familiar companion. It held no menace, no hidden threat. It was simply the state of things in the St. Jude's Annex after midnight. I felt secure in my knowledge of it, in my ability to navigate its depths. The world outside could be chaotic and unpredictable, but in here, I was surrounded by the logic and reason of medicine. I was safe. And so, I sat at my desk, a solitary figure in a pool of light, surrounded by the deep and profound stillness of the night. I turned a page in my textbook, the soft rustle of the paper seeming unnaturally loud in the quiet. I was completely at ease, unaware that the heavy, silent blanket I had found such comfort in was about to be pulled away, revealing the cold, terrifying thing that had been hiding underneath it all along. The foundation of my predictable world was about to crack. It happened at precisely 3:03 a.m. The sound was so alien in the profound quiet that for a second, my brain refused to process it. It wasn't a loud, panicked siren, but something more insidious. A high-pitched, insistent electronic beep that repeated every 2 seconds. It sliced through the silence, sharp and clean. My head snapped up from my textbook, my heart giving a single hard thump against my ribs. Every nerve ending, previously lulled by the stillness, was now wide awake and on high alert. The symphony of the night suddenly had a new, unwelcome instrument. My eyes darted to the nurse's station console, where a small red light was flashing in perfect time with the piercing beep. The light was labeled Room 303. My first reaction wasn't fear, but a wave of professional annoyance. Room 303 was empty. It hadn't been occupied in at least 6 months. It had to be a technical glitch, a short circuit in the ancient wiring of the annex. It was the kind of petty inconvenience this old building was known for. A ghost in the machine born of decay, not spirits. Pushing back from the desk, my chair letting out a loud groan, I started the walk down the west corridor. The squeak of my shoes seemed to mock the urgency of the alarm. The corridor stretched before me, a tunnel of pale green walls and sterile, even lighting. Each beep of the alarm seemed to echo off the linoleum, counting my steps. I kept my gaze fixed on the door of 303, half expecting the light to stop flashing, for the building to correct its own mistake. But the sound was relentless, a digital pulse in the heart of the silent wing. My medical mind was already diagnosing the building. Faulty wiring, a pressure-sensitive connection that had finally failed. Maybe a rodent had chewed through something. In the walls, I had a dozen logical, mundane explanations ready. The supernatural had no place in my world of evidence-based practice. Fear is born from the unknown, and I was determined to make this known, to categorize it as just another maintenance issue to be logged in the morning report for the day shift to handle. I reached the door to 303 and pushed it open. The room was exactly as I knew it to be, barren and cold. A naked mattress sat on the metal-framed bed, its plastic cover faintly gleaming under the hallway light that spilled in behind me. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of dust and disuse. The call button cord was dangling beside the bed, its red plastic button swaying slightly, as if someone had just pressed it. The sight was incongruous, a sign of life in a room utterly devoid of it. Stepping inside, I walked over to the dangling cord. The button itself was a simple mechanism, designed for the weak grip of a sick patient. I took it in my hand. The plastic was smooth and cool. I pressed the cancel switch next to it, and the small light on the wall unit went out. Simultaneously, the piercing beep from the nurse's station ceased. The silence that rushed back in to fill the void was somehow heavier than before, more profound. It felt less like peace and more like a held breath, an unnatural pause. I stood there for a long moment in the empty room, just listening. There was nothing but the familiar, distant hum of the building's ventilation. No sign of entry, no hidden person. It was just an empty room with a faulty switch. I felt a small measure of relief, the satisfaction of a problem identified and seemingly solved. I made a firm mental note to write up a maintenance request first thing. Room 303, call button malfunctioning, potential short circuit. It was simple, logical, and reassuringly boring. Walking back to the nurse's station, my footsteps were slower, more deliberate. I was consciously trying to recapture the sense of calm from before, and force the night back into its predictable box. The incident was over. It was an anomaly, a single data point that could be easily explained and dismissed. I sat back down in my chair, the springs groaning their familiar complaint. I looked at the monitors, 4 small screens of absolute stillness. The wing was quiet again. The order was restored, but my focus was fractured. I stared at the page of my cardiology textbook, but the words wouldn't coalesce into meaning. The echo of that beep seemed to linger in my mind's ear. Every normal sound of the annex, the buzz of the lights, the soft rush of air, now seemed to carry a different weight. I found myself listening intently, waiting for the sound to return, even as I told myself it wouldn't. The shield of certainty had been pierced by a single tiny hole. About 20 minutes passed. I had managed to read the same paragraph 4 times, my concentration shattered. I was just about to get up and do another round, just to reassure myself, when it happened again. The same high-pitched, methodical beep. My entire body went rigid. A cold dread, heavy and immediate, washed over me, completely bypassing annoyance this time. I looked at the console, praying to see the light for 303 again. But it wasn't 303. A different red light was flashing. Room 307. Room 307 was in the east corridor, the opposite end of the wing. The chances of 2 separate, unrelated electrical shorts happening in 2 different empty rooms within half an hour of each other felt astronomically small. Coincidence was a luxury I could no longer afford. This was a pattern. The logic I had been clinging to so desperately began to feel like sand slipping through my fingers. My heart was beating faster now, a frantic, unsteady rhythm against the cold, steady beep of the alarm. I stood up slowly, my eyes locked on the flashing red light. All the rational explanations were still there in my head, but they were being drowned out by a rising tide of primal fear. A building-wide power surge, a systemic failure in the call system. It was possible. It was logical. But it didn't feel right. My gaze drifted to the security monitors, searching the grainy black and white images of the empty hallways for something, anything, that was out of place. The hallways remained starkly, unnervingly empty. This time, my walk to the source of the alarm felt entirely different. There was no professional purpose, only a creeping sense of dread. Each squeak of my shoes was a small, frightened sound in a vast, listening silence. I found myself looking into the doorways of the other empty rooms as I passed, my breath held tight in my chest. The annex no longer felt like my domain. It felt alien, and I felt like an intruder in its oppressive quiet. Reaching room 307, I hesitated at the door, my hand hovering over the handle. I was acutely aware of my own solitude. The sky bridge to the main hospital, with its staff and its noise and its safety, had never felt so far away. I was completely, utterly alone with this. Taking a shallow breath, I pushed the door open, expecting... I don't know what I was expecting. A fire, a person, an answer. But the room was, of course, identical to 303. It was just another empty space. A bare bed, a disconnected nightstand, and a profound sense of abandonment. The call button. Cord was hanging innocently by the wall. I walked over, my movements feeling stiff and robotic, and canceled the alarm. Once again, the silence descended, absolute and immediate. I didn't feel relief this time. I felt a deep and pervading chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. This wasn't a malfunction. I backed out of the room slowly, pulling the door shut without taking my eyes off the long, vacant stretch of the east corridor. The logical part of my brain was still fighting, still trying to build a fortress of reason around the events. But another part, a more ancient and instinctive part, knew that something was fundamentally wrong. The building wasn't malfunctioning. It felt like it was communicating, sending out a signal from its empty rooms, a call from a patient that did not exist. Back at the nurse's station, I didn't sit down. I stood before the bank of monitors, my arms crossed tightly against my chest. The 4 screens showed me nothing but emptiness and silence. Yet, I knew they were lying. The silence was a lie. The stillness was a lie. Something was here with me. Something that could move between locked rooms and press buttons without making a sound or showing its face. My role had changed. I was no longer a doctor on a quiet shift. I was a watchman, guarding against an enemy I couldn't see. I stared at the monitor for the west corridor, then the east. I kept thinking about the 2 rooms, 303 and 307, at opposite ends of my small world. It felt deliberate. It felt like a test. It was as if something was measuring the space, mapping out its boundaries, and in the process, mapping out mine. It was checking to see if I was paying attention. Now, it had my full, undivided attention. The quiet that followed was the worst part. It was no longer a comforting blanket, but a taut, stretched wire, vibrating with tension. Every low hum and distant creak of the old building was now a potential threat, a prelude to the next signal. I waited for the next beep, my ears straining against the silence, my body locked in a state of high alert. The night was no longer empty. It was full of a terrifying, unseen presence I thought about calling security at the main hospital. But what would I say? That 2 empty rooms had faulty alarms? They would tell me to write a maintenance report, just as I had planned to do myself what felt like a lifetime ago. They would think I was jumpy, an overstressed resident spooked by an old building's groans. I was on my own. And the chilling thought that kept circling in my head was simple. A machine can glitch once. A machine can glitch twice. But what if it wasn't the machine? Time ceased to be measured in minutes, and instead was marked by the frantic beating of my own heart. I remained standing at the nurse's station, a statue carved from fear, my eyes scanning the 4 silent monitors. The stillness on the screens felt like a deliberate lie, a placid surface concealing some deep and predatory creature. I knew waiting for the next signal was a fool's errand. It would leave me passive, a sitting target. I had to move. I had to reclaim some semblance of control, even if it was an illusion. My new purpose was clear. I would conduct a full, meticulous sweep of the entire wing. My previous rounds had been for patient care. This one was a hunt. I was looking for the source of the wrongness, a physical clue that could anchor my fear to reality. I started with the main entrance to the annex, the double doors leading to the sky bridge. They were locked solid, the magnetic lock humming with steady power. I checked every window in the hallway, pressing my fingers against the yawl, cool glass. All sealed, all locked from the inside. The building was supposed to be a closed system, a hermetically sealed bubble, but something was inside with me. I moved with a tense, practiced slowness, making my squeaking shoes the only sound I produced. I checked the doors to every empty room, confirming they were shut. I peered into the small supply closets, there, interiors smelling of rubbing alcohol and bleach, finding nothing but neatly arranged boxes and containers. For a while, I found nothing out of place. This lack of evidence was a torment in itself, making me question my own sanity. Was I truly just an overworked resident, cracking under the strain of solitude and silence? Then I saw it. Halfway down, the east corridor, there was a linen cart, a 3-tiered metal trolley I had passed at least 4 times already tonight. On my last check, it had been a model of order, with perfectly folded white sheets and blue towels stacked in neat columns. Now, a single stack of sheets on the bottom shelf had been disturbed. 6 of them were pulled onto the floor, in a messy heap, their stark whiteness a glaring stain against the polished linoleum. It was a small, almost trivial detail, but it screamed at me. My mind immediately began its desperate search for a rational cause. Could a powerful gust from a ceiling vent have done this? I looked up. The vent was still, not a whisper of air coming from it. Could I have bumped the cart on a previous pass without noticing? I knew I hadn't. I was meticulously careful in my movements, hyper-aware of my surroundings. This mess wasn't accidental. It was too localized, too specific. The other stacks on, the cart remained untouched, perfectly aligned. This was an act. A new, colder fear began to seep into my bones, different from the jumpy alert state I'd been in. This was the fear of a confirmed presence. It meant someone was physically here, moving through the same spaces I was, breathing the same sterile air. My eyes darted down the length of the empty corridor, then back the other way. Where could they be? Every room was either occupied or empty and locked. Every closet was accounted for. The annex was a map I knew by heart, and there were no places left to hide. I forced myself to continue my patrol, my senses now sharpened to a razor's edge. Every shadow seemed deeper, every flicker of the fluorescent lights a potential omen. I approached the small staff kitchenette and break room, a place I had used just hours earlier. The door was slightly ajar. I stopped dead, my blood running cold. I distinctly remembered closing it firmly behind me after getting my coffee. I never left doors open. It was a rule of habit in a place that demanded precision. With a shaking hand, I pushed the door fully open. The room was empty, dark except for the light spilling in from the hall. I flicked on the overhead light, and my eyes immediately fell upon the central countertop, a small island of stainless steel. There, in the exact center of the gleaming, sterile surface, sat a single object that did not belong. It was a scalpel, its silver handle and razor-sharp blade reflecting the fluorescent light with a malevolent glint. It was placed with perfect, geometric precision, an offering left by an unseen hand. This was the breaking point. This was the moment my denial shattered completely. The call buttons could have been a complex, cascading electrical failure. The messy sheets on the cart could have been a freak accident. But the scalpel was different. It was an intelligent action. It required forethought, knowledge of where medical supplies were kept, and a quiet, deliberate movement to place it there. It wasn't a threat of violence. It felt like something worse. It was a message. I am here. I can go anywhere. I can touch anything. I backed away from the kitchenette, pulling the door shut and spinning around, my gaze now locked on the nurse's station at the end of the hall. The security monitors. They were my only eyes, my only hope of catching a glimpse of this phantom. I ran, my shoes squeaking frantically on the floor, the sound a frantic drumbeat of my terror. I skidded to a halt at the desk, my hands flying over the console, ignoring the live feeds and going straight for the recorded footage. My hands were trembling as I navigated the clumsy, outdated software. I selected the feed from the last hour, a grid of 4 videos playing out in silence. I hit fast forward, my eyes scanning the grainy images for any flicker of movement, any change in the static landscape of the empty halls. The footage blurred past. Me walking my rounds, me sitting at the desk, me getting up to investigate the first alarm. It was a lonely, pathetic record of my own spiraling fear. I focused on the minutes I was inside room 303, then 307. The hallways, on the monitors, remained empty. I forwarded to the time I must have been on my patrol, the time the sheet must have been pulled and the scalpel placed. Nothing. The intruder was a ghost on the recordings, moving in the blind spots or in the moments, between camera sweeps. A wave of hopelessness washed over me. What good were eyes that couldn't see? Then I remembered the long, unused corridor at the far end of the West Wing. It led to a section of the hospital that had been sealed off in the 90s. It was a dead end, a place no one ever went. Monitor 2 had a corner of it in its view. My gut screaming at me, I isolated that feed and began to meticulously scan the last hour, my face inches from the screen, searching the deep shadows and grainy static. For a long time there was nothing but shimmering black and white emptiness. I was about to give up, to dismiss it as another dead end, when I saw it. For the briefest of moments, the image flickered. I paused the footage, my breath catching in my throat. I used the shuttle control to advance the recording frame by agonizing. Frame. The corridor was empty. The next frame, a dark shape was there, a vertical blur of motion. The frame after, it was more defined, but still moving too fast to be human. The third frame, it was gone. I played the 3 frames back and forth. A blur, A shape. Gone. It was less than 1/10 of a second of footage. A phantom caught in the machine. But it was there. It was undeniable. It was a shape that moved with a speed and fluidity that didn't seem natural. A smear of darkness against the pale, sterile wall. It was the first visual confirmation. It was the concrete proof that my sanity was not in question. My entire body was trembling, a cocktail of terror and vindication coursing through my veins. I wasn't going crazy. The building wasn't haunted by glitches. There was something here, in the annex with me. Something that was fast, quiet, and intelligent. It knew the layout. It knew how to avoid the cameras. And it was deliberately toying with me, leaving its calling cards in the form of errant call buttons and carefully placed scalpels. I leaned back in the chair, my eyes still glued to the frozen image of the blur on monitor 2. The static on the screen seemed to buzz more loudly now, no longer a simple artifact of old technology, but a veil, a curtain trying to obscure a terrible truth. The entity in this wing was real, and it was watching me from the shadows. The game had changed. This was no longer about strange noises. It was about survival. I saved the short clip of footage, my fingers feeling clumsy and numb. It was my only piece of evidence, my only proof that I wasn't imagining the escalating horror of this night. The silence of the wing returned, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the silence of a hunting ground, the silence of a place where one creature knows it is no longer the only predator in the dark. I looked from the monitor to the long, empty hallway stretched out before my station. It looked exactly the same as it had 3 hours ago, calm and sterile. But I knew it was a lie. It was a stage. And somewhere in the wings, hidden in the dark and forgotten corners of this old building, my tormentor was waiting. It was watching. And I had no idea what it planned to do next. My universe had collapsed to the dimensions of a 19-inch monitor. I sat hunched forward, replaying the 3 frames of grainy footage again and again. Blur, shape, gone. It was a hypnotic loop of terror, the only tangible proof that my world had tilted off its axis. Each viewing burned the image deeper into my mind, a brand of pure fear. The rational physician in me tried to analyze it. A lens flare, a digital artifact, a bird flying past an unseen window. But the primal part of my brain knew the truth. I was watching my predator. The long minutes that followed were a unique form of torture. The silence and stillness returned, but now they were charged with an unbearable sense of anticipation. Every hum of a machine, every creak of the aging building was a potential footstep, a prelude to a new horror. My senses were stretched to their breaking point. I started seeing movement in the noisy static of the monitors, dark shapes that would resolve back into nothingness when I blinked. I was losing my grip on the line between observation and paranoia. My duty as a doctor felt like a distant memory, a role I had played in a different life. Still, a nagging fragment of my conscience compelled me to check the vital signs monitors for Mr. Henderson and Mrs. Gable. Their heart rates were steady, their oxygen saturation normal. They were sleeping peacefully, completely unaware of the silent drama unfolding around them. This fact offered no comfort. Instead, it amplified my terror. I was their sole protector, and I was failing, paralyzed by fear before an enemy I couldn't even properly see. I kept my eyes scanning the 4 monitors in a frantic, repeating cycle. West corridor, empty. East corridor, empty. the nurse's station, showing my own terrified silhouette. The sky bridge doors, sealed and silent. It was a maddening routine, staring at nothing, while every instinct screamed that something was about to happen. I was a mouse watching 4 separate holes, knowing the cat could emerge from any one of them at any moment. The strain was immense, a physical weight pressing down on my chest. Then, on monitor 2, the East Corridor feed, the static image changed. It wasn't the blur from before. This was different. Slower, more deliberate. From the deepest part of the hallway, where the corridor plunged into a pool of shadow beyond the reach of the last fluorescent light, a figure stepped forward. It moved with a liquid smoothness that was deeply unsettling. It was tall, slender, and its form was just a dark shape against the pale green walls. It took 3 slow steps into the light and then stopped. My breath caught in my throat, a dry, rasping sound. I was completely frozen, my muscles locked tight. The figure stood perfectly still, about 40 yards away, its back to the camera. It was simply standing there, a silent, impossible sentinel in the middle of my sterile, controlled world. The grainy, low-resolution feed denied me any details. No face, no clothes, just a humanoid silhouette where no silhouette should be. Time itself seemed to stop, stretching the single second of its appearance into an eternity of dread. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen. The figure was a statue of pure menace. My hand twitched towards the telephone on the desk, the lifeline to security, to help, to the sane world of the main hospital. But a deeper, more primal instinct held me back. To look away, even for a second, felt like a fatal mistake. As long as I was watching it, it was somehow contained, trapped within the confines of that small screen. Then, it happened. The thing that would be burned into my memory forever. The figure, which had been so unnervingly still, moved. But it didn't move its body. With an impossibly slow, fluid grace, it turned its head. The motion was unnervingly smooth, like a rotating mannequin head, devoid of the subtle jerks of human musculature. The pale, blurry oval of its face turned until it was looking directly back down the corridor. It was looking directly at the security camera. It was looking directly at me. A guttural sound of pure terror escaped my lips. This wasn't a random intruder. This wasn't a lost patient. This thing knew. It knew about the cameras. It knew I was in this room, at this desk, watching. The act of it looking at the camera was a direct and profound violation. It shattered the illusion of safety a screen provides. It reached through the monitor and established a connection, a terrifying intimacy. I was no longer observing it. We were observing each other. In that instant, pure animal panic obliterated all rational thought. I shoved my chair back with such force that it slammed into the wall behind me. My fight-or-flight response chose a suicidal third option, confrontation. I couldn't sit here and be watched. I couldn't be a spectator to my own haunting. I needed to see it with my own eyes, to prove the grainy image was real. I scanned the desk for a weapon, my hand closing around the only thing with any heft. A heavy, metal-bound patient chart clipboard. Clutching the clipboard like a shield, I bolted. From the relative safety of the nurse's station, my sneakers, which had squeaked with caution before, now slapped frantically against the linoleum as I sprinted down the east corridor. The alarm beeps were gone, but a new sound filled the air. The frantic, ragged sound of my own breathing and the blood pounding in my ears. I was running towards the danger, fueled by a mad cocktail of adrenaline and terror. I rounded the final corner. My body braced for impact. The clipboard held high. I expected to see it there, the tall, slender figure standing at the end of the hall. But there was nothing. The corridor was completely, utterly empty. The air was still and cold. I ran to the very end, slamming my hand against the sealed double. Doors to the old ward, locked, solid. There were no other doors, no closets, no alcoves, nowhere for it to have gone. It was impossible. It couldn't have just vanished. It would have had to run past me to get to the other end of the wing, and I would have seen it. I stood there, panting, my heart feeling like it was going to burst from my chest. I was alone in the silent, empty hallway. Doubt began to creep back in. The horrifying thought that my mind had finally snapped, that I had projected my fear onto the screen. Defeated and shaking, I walked slowly back to the nurse's station. My legs felt weak, my adrenaline crash leaving, me hollow and trembling. Was it all a hallucination? Had the strain finally broken me? I collapsed into my chair, my eyes drawn back to monitor 2, expecting to see the empty hallway confirmed on the screen. The hallway was empty, just as I had left it. But something else had changed. Something was different. My eyes scanned the image, and then I saw it. The door to room 305, Mrs. Gable's room. Throughout this entire ordeal, I had known with absolute certainty that her door was closed. I had checked it myself. Now, on the monitor, it was clearly, undeniably ajar. A dark, vertical slit in the uniformity of the wall. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The figure on the monitor wasn't a phantom. It was a diversion. While I was transfixed, watching the end of the corridor, it hadn't been there at all. It had been somewhere else. It had been right here, just a few feet from my station. It had been at my patient's door. The watcher on the monitor wasn't the threat. It was the magician's misdirection. The real horror was what the other hand was doing while I was distracted, and it had just touched the last bastion of safety I thought I had. For a long moment, I was paralyzed. My gaze locked on the dark slit of the open door on the monitor. The image was a profound violation, a symbol of my ultimate failure. All my focus had been on the phantom at the end of the hall, and the real threat had slipped past me, silent and unseen. A wave of ice-cold adrenaline surged through me, this time not with fear, but with a sudden, horrifying clarity. My patient, Mrs. Gable. It had been at her door. It had gotten to her door. That single thought broke my paralysis. I grabbed the heavy clipboard again, its weight a pathetic comfort, and launched myself from the chair. I ran the short distance to room 305, my mind a chaotic storm of worst-case scenarios. Had it harmed her? Disconnected the ventilator? In the few seconds I was distracted, what could it have done? The potential consequences of my failure flashed through my mind, each one more horrific than the last. I was no longer just scared for myself. I was terrified for the fragile life in my care. I burst through the door, my eyes frantically scanning the room. But there was no chaos. There was no sign of struggle. The room was just as it had been. Mrs. Gable lay peacefully in her bed, her chest rising and falling with the gentle, rhythmic push of the ventilator. I rushed to her side, my eyes darting over the machine's display. All the numbers were green. Her heart rate was stable, her oxygen levels perfect. She was completely unharmed. I did a swift, thorough check of the room, my hands shaking. Nothing was missing. Nothing was out of place. I backed out of the room, pulling the door firmly shut, behind me, my heart still hammering against my ribs. The intruder had done nothing. It had opened the door, proven it could get to the most vulnerable person in the wing, and then retreated. This realization was more chilling than any act of violence. This wasn't a mindless monster. It was intelligent. It was sending a message. The message was simple and devastating. I can get to them whenever I want. Your presence is irrelevant, as noir. I walked back to the nurse's station. The terror began to recede, replaced by something new. A cold, hard, and deeply personal anger. I had been played. The figure on the monitor was a feint, a masterful piece of psychological warfare designed to draw my attention while the real move was made. This entity wasn't just trying to scare me. It was asserting its dominance over my environment. It was treating my shift, my responsibilities, my very reality as a game board. And I had been made a pawn. That anger became my new fuel. Fear had made me reactive and foolish. Anger would make me proactive. I would not be toyed with again. If I was to be the sole guardian of this wing, then I would turn it into a fortress. I spent the next hour in a flurry of determined activity. My first stop was the supply closet, where I found a roll of heavy-duty medical tape. I went to every single empty room, 303, 307, and all the others, and meticulously taped over the call button mechanisms, physically disabling them. There would be no more false alarms. Next, I addressed the doors. I went back to the supply closet and found a box of thick rubber doorstops. I took one and wedged it hard under the main entrance to the sky bridge, adding a physical barrier to the electronic lock. I did the same for Mr. Henderson's room and for Mrs. Gable's room, jamming the wedges so tightly they wouldn't budge. My last act was to secure the break room, my only personal space. I was building a new set of rules for this place. When the sun finally rose, casting long, pale fingers of light down the corridors, it brought with it the sounds of the day shift. Dr. Amin, a cheerful, perpetually tired physician, arrived to take my report. I carefully curated my story, omitting the figure, the scalpel, the sheer, paralyzing terror. I reported the cascading electrical faults with the call system and the glitch that left Mrs. Gable's door open. He listened with a sympathetic but dismissive air, promising to have maintenance paged. I could see in his eyes he thought I was just another resident spooked by a long night. I knew then that I was completely on my own. No one would believe me. Any attempt to explain the full truth would likely result in a psychiatric evaluation and my removal from duty. Help was not coming. So, I went home not to collapse into bed, but with a new mission. I stopped at an office, supply store, and bought a thick black hardcover notebook and a pack of fine-tipped pens. Sleep was a luxury I could no longer afford. Documentation was a necessity. That evening, I returned to the annex for my next shift, feeling like a soldier returning to a battlefield. The air was still thick with the same sterile silence, but I was different. I opened my new notebook on the desk at the nurse's station. On the first page, I drew a detailed map of the entire wing, marking every room, closet, camera location, and a new addition. My defenses. On the following pages, I began to write. I documented every event from the eye, previous night with obsessive detail, times, locations, my reactions, my theories. This log became my anchor. It was an attempt to impose logic and order on a situation that defied both. It was my secret weapon, a written history of the war only I knew I was fighting. The act of writing it all down, of externalizing the fear into neat lines of ink on a page, was strangely calming. It felt like I was building a case, gathering evidence for a jury that would never convene. It was a testament to my own sanity in the face of the unbelievable. My first patrol of the night was different. I moved with purpose, checking my fortifications. The tape on the call buttons was undisturbed. The rubber wedges were still firmly in place beneath the doors. The annex felt more secure, the silence less menacing. It was now a silence I had, in a small way, imposed myself. I had taken back a fraction of the control that had been stolen from me. It was a fragile, temporary feeling, but it was enough. I settled in at the nurse's station for the long night ahead. My textbook remained in my bag, forgotten. My new Bible was the logbook lying open on the desk next to the monitor console. I watched the 4 screens with a new kind of focus. I was no longer a passive, terrified observer waiting for the next jump scare. I was a guard on the wall of my own small, besieged castle. I had adapted to the threat. I had built my defenses. There was a strange, tense peace in the first few hours of that shift. Nothing happened. The hallways remained empty. The doors remained closed. The silence was just silence. A small, dangerous part of me began to wonder if my actions had worked. Perhaps the entity, faced with a target that was now fighting back, had retreated. Perhaps I had won the first skirmish, secured my territory, and the worst was over. This brief sensation of victory was a dangerous illusion. I had created my fortress of one, a small island of perceived safety in the vast, dark ocean of the night. But I had made a critical error. I had assumed I was dealing with a simple intruder, a creature of habit that could be thwarted by physical barriers. I had yet to understand the true nature of the intelligence I was facing. It wasn't just trying to get in. It was already inside, and it was learning. It was adapting just as I was, and it was about to change the rules of the game entirely. The first few hours of my shift were deceptively peaceful. My fortress held. The silence was no longer a threatening presence, but a neutral state, a quiet that I felt I was now in command of. I patrolled the corridors every half hour, my hand brushing against the wedged doors, reassuring myself they were secure. I would return to my station and make a new entry in my logbook. 0230, all quiet, fortifications holding, no anomalies. Each entry was a small victory, a brick I was laying in the wall of my sanity. A dangerous sense of pride began to bloom in my chest. I had faced an unknown, terrifying phenomenon and had met it with logic and procedure. I had analyzed its methods, auditory and visual deceptions, and had countered them with physical barriers and meticulous documentation. Perhaps that was all it took. Perhaps the entity was a simple, opportunistic thing, and now that the opportunities were removed, it had simply faded back into whatever cracks it had emerged from. I allowed myself to believe, for a moment, that I had won. My hourly patient rounds became a confirmation of my success. I went to Mrs. Gable's room first. The rubber doorstop was still wedged tightly, requiring a firm tug to open the door. Inside, all was calm, the ventilator breathing its steady rhythm. I checked on Mr. Henderson, his door equally secure, his soft snores undisturbed. My system was working. The physical barriers were holding. The patients were safe. I felt a surge of relief, a loosening of the knot of terror in my stomach. As I walked back to the nurse's station, however, the relief began to curdle. The hallways seemed too still. The silence felt too perfect. My footsteps, the only sound in the wing, echoed with a profound loneliness. It was the kind of deep, waiting quiet that precedes a storm. A cold prickle of unease traced its way up my spine. My confidence, so recently gained, began to feel like foolish arrogance. Something was wrong. The feeling was as certain and inexplicable as a change in barometric pressure. I reached my desk, and my heart stopped. There, lying on the open page of my logbook, was an object. It was a pair of surgical scissors, the delicate, sharp-tipped kind used for cutting fine sutures. They were placed with unnerving precision directly over the hand-drawn map of my defenses, the one I had so proudly sketched just hours before. The sharp points of the blades were aimed at the drawing of the nurse's station, at the very spot where I was now standing. My blood ran cold. It was impossible. I had been gone for no more than 5 minutes. The main doors were wedged. There was no way in or out. How could anyone have gotten to my desk, to my personal logbook, in that short time without making a sound? This wasn't just a breach of my fortress. It was a violation of my mind, a direct commentary on my efforts. The message was brutally, terrifyingly clear. Your plans are child's play. Your walls are meaningless. I can reach you anywhere. With trembling hands, I lunged for the security console, frantically rewinding the footage of the last 5 minutes. I watched the grainy image of myself getting up and leaving for my rounds. The nurse's station sat empty, still and silent on the screen. There was no flicker of movement, no blur, no shadowy figure. And then, I saw myself walk back into the frame. The scissors were not there when I left, but they were there when I returned. They had simply appeared, as if materialized from the air itself. The entity had not been caught on camera. It knew the camera's refresh rate, its blind spots, or it was simply too fast for the old system to capture. The realization was sickening. I was being watched by something that understood my own surveillance system better than I did. My anger and resolve from the previous night evaporated, replaced by a raw, helpless fear. This thing hadn't just been in the halls. It had been here, at my desk, inches from where I sat, touching my most private thoughts. I felt 1,000 unseen eyes on me. I scanned the shadows of the nurse's station, my gaze flitting up to the acoustic tiles of the ceiling and the dark metal grill of the air vent. Was it in the walls? In the ceiling? Was it watching me right now, enjoying my panic? The feeling of exposure was absolute. The annex was no longer a large, empty space, but a claustrophobic trap. My fortress had become my prison, and I was locked, inside with my tormentor. For what felt like an hour, I didn't move, a stone of terror at my desk. But the human body has its limits. A creeping thirst, and the need to escape the stationary torment of the desk, finally forced me to my feet. I decided to go to the break room for a bottle of water. I needed to do something, anything, to feel a flicker of normalcy. I approached the break room door, which was still wedged shut from the inside, a fact that offered zero comfort now. I pulled the door open and stepped inside. The room was as I had left it, small, windowless, and quiet. The old coffee machine gurgled softly. I turned to get a bottle of water from the small refrigerator, and then I saw it. On the small laminate table, placed squarely in the center, was another gift. It was a photograph, old and curled at the edges. A black and white picture of a woman in a starched, old-fashioned nurse's uniform from what looked like the 1960s. She stood, severe and unsmiling, in a room I instantly recognized as one of the annexes. My hand shook as I picked it up. The paper felt brittle, ancient. The nurse's eyes seemed to bore into me from across the decades. I turned the photograph over. On the back, written in a faint, spidery cursive that looked like it had been written with a fountain pen, was a single, chilling word. Watching. A wave of nausea rolled through me. This wasn't just an intruder. This was something connected to this place, to its history. This changed everything. My fortifications were a joke. My logbook was an open book to it. This threat was not only intelligent and elusive, but it was also deeply personal and historical. It was leaving me curated artifacts, messages that were becoming more specific, more psychological. The scalpel was a general threat. The scissors on my map were a direct rebuttal to my strategy. But this photograph, this was a claim of ownership. It was telling me it belonged here, and I was the intruder. I stumbled back to the nurse's station, the photograph clutched in my hand. I looked from the severe face of the nurse in the picture to the silent, watching monitors. The game was no longer about scaring the lone resident on the night shift. The gifts proved a deeper, more terrifying motive. It wasn't about territory anymore. It was about me. It was prying into my mind, learning my strategies, and then leaving calculated responses designed to dismantle my sanity piece by piece. The feeling of being a guard on a castle wall was gone, replaced by the sickening realization that I was a specimen under a microscope. My fear, my anger, my attempts to fight back, they were all just reactions to be observed. The entity was not just a presence in the annex, it was an intelligence, and it was studying me. And the most terrifying part was the dawning understanding that I had no idea what its experiment was meant to prove. The rest of my shift passed in a haze of pure, undiluted terror. I didn't leave the nurse's station again. I sat rigidly in my chair, the old photograph on the desk before me, its single-word message a burning indictment. My logbook lay open, but I couldn't bring myself to write in it. Documenting this new personal level of violation felt like admitting defeat. The entity had escalated beyond simple haunting. It was now demonstrating a deep, historical knowledge of the place, and it was using that knowledge to break me. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that I could not survive another night like this alone. My mind, desperate for a lifeline, fastened onto one name, Dr. Evans. He was my attending physician, a senior doctor with a sharp, logical mind who I respected immensely. He was a man of evidence and reason, and I foolishly believed that if I could just present my evidence to him correctly, he would have to believe me. As the sun rose, I steeled my resolve. I would corner him after the morning handoff. I would lay out the entire timeline, from the first call button to the photograph. I would make him understand. My professional survival depended on it. After giving my sanitized report to the morning nurse, I waited until Dr. Evans was alone in his office, a small cluttered space that smelled of old books and coffee. I knocked on the open door, and he waved me in, a tired but kind smile on his face. My composure crumbled instantly. The words spilled out of me in a frantic, disjointed torrent. I told him everything. The sounds, the figure on the monitor, the scalpel, the scissors on my map. My voice was trembling, my hands shaking as I finally, desperately, held out the photograph as my proof. Dr. Evans listened with a practiced patience, his expression slowly morphing from genuine concern to a kind of clinical assessment. He took the photograph from my shaking hand, examining it with a dispassionate eye. "Eris," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "This wing is full of old junk left over from decades of service. Someone probably found this during a clean-out." He then proceeded to dismantle my entire story with calm medical precision. The figure? A classic sign of a stress-induced hypnagogic hallucination. The sounds? Faulty wiring. My feelings of being watched. Textbook paranoia brought on by severe sleep deprivation. His rationalizations were a brick wall against which my terror crashed and crumbled. He wasn't being cruel. He was being a doctor, diagnosing what he saw as the most likely ailment. A resident cracking under pressure. "I want you to take the next few nights off, son," he concluded, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Get some real sleep. We can even arrange a chat with Dr. Wells in psychiatry, just to have a confidential outlet." The offer, meant to be kind, felt like a judgment. He didn't believe a single word. He thought I was losing my mind. Desperate, I remembered my one piece of hard evidence. "The footage," I stammered, pulling away. "I saved the security footage of the figure. I can prove it." I led him back to the nurse's station, a wild, irrational hope surging in my chest. This would convince him. I sat at the console, my fingers flying across the keyboard to the directory where I had saved the video file. I clicked on it. A small box popped up on the screen with a single devastating sentence. "Error. File is corrupted and cannot be played." I stared at the screen in disbelief. I tried again. The same error. I checked the directory. The entire hour of footage from that time block was gone, replaced by a useless, unreadable file. The entity hadn't just avoided the cameras. It had somehow reached into the hospital's server and surgically removed the only objective proof I had. I turned to Dr. Evans, my face pale, my last hope extinguished. The look on his face was one of profound, sorrowful pity. My final gambit had only served to cement his diagnosis of my instability. Defeated and humiliated, I left the hospital. The bright morning sun felt alien and harsh. I drove home in a daze, the world outside my car window seeming distant and unreal. There was one last person I could turn to, my girlfriend, Clara. She was a graphic designer, a creative soul who lived outside the rigid, skeptical world of medicine. Surely she would believe me. I called her, my voice cracking with exhaustion and fear as I tried to explain the unexplainable over the phone. But my desperation worked against me. To her, my story sounded like a frantic, paranoid delusion. I spoke of impossible figures and disappearing evidence, of messages from ghosts and photographs. She listened patiently, but her responses were filled with the same gentle, worried concern as Dr. Evans's. "Oh, Ari," she said softly, her voice full of a sympathy that broke my heart. "You're not sleeping. You see horrible things at work all day. It's no wonder your mind is playing tricks on you. You need to rest." Her loving concern was a more devastating blow than Dr. Evans's clinical dismissal. He saw me as a malfunctioning resident. She saw me as a partner who was unwell. Both conclusions pointed to the same terrifying truth. I was completely and utterly alone in this. The antagonist wasn't just leaving gifts and moving through walls. It was systematically dismantling my credibility, turning my own pleas for help into proof of my hysteria. It was isolating me from my career, my relationships, my own sense of reality. I ended the call with Clara, promising I would try to sleep. But I knew I wouldn't. Sleep felt like a surrender, an invitation for the darkness to seep in completely. I sat in my silent apartment, the normalcy of it feeling like a thin, fragile veneer. My support system was gone. My boss thought I was hallucinating. My girlfriend thought I was having a breakdown. I had no one left to turn to. No one who would believe the impossible truth. That evening, I had to return to the annex. I had refused Dr. Evans's offer of time off because I knew that accepting it would be the final nail in the coffin of my career, an admission that I couldn't handle the pressure. Walking through the sky bridge felt like a condemned man walking the final mile. The silence that greeted me in the wing was no longer just menacing. It was mocking. It was the silence of a place that knew my secret and knew that no one would ever believe it. I sat down at the nurse's station, the chair groaning under my weight. The only thing on the desk was my logbook. It was no longer a tool for investigation. It was my only confidant. The only place I could tell the truth without being judged as insane. The annex was no longer just a hospital wing. It had become my own private asylum, and the entity was my warden. I was trapped, not just by walls and locked doors, but by the perfect, impenetrable prison of disbelief. And as the darkness deepened outside, I knew that whatever came next, I would have to face it utterly alone. My shift began in a state of quiet resignation. The anger had burned out, leaving behind only the cold, gray ash of despair. I performed my duties like an automaton, a ghost moving through a haunted house that only I could see. I checked on Mr. Henderson. I monitored Mrs. Gable's ventilator. I walked the silent, sterile corridors of my fortress, knowing full well its walls were made of paper. My logbook lay open on the desk, its pages filled with the ravings of a man everyone believed to be insane. It felt less like a record and more like a final testament. The constant, fruitless surveillance of the four monitors was a new form of torture. Before, I had watched them with a desperate hope of catching a glimpse of my tormentor. Now, I watched them with the dull certainty that I would see nothing. The entity was too smart, too elusive. It moved in the spaces between moments, in the blind spots of technology and perception. Staring at the empty hallways only amplified my sense of isolation, reminding me that I was the only one who saw the monster hiding in plain sight. Overwhelmed by the oppressive quiet and the futility of my vigil, I felt an overpowering need to escape the nurse's station. I needed a moment away from the all-seeing eyes of the cameras, even if I was the only one watching them. I retreated to the staff break room, my last remaining sanctuary. It was the one place in the annex without a camera. I closed the door behind me and pushed the small, flimsy button lock on the handle. It was a pathetic gesture, but it was the only privacy I could claim. Inside, the silence was different. It was a contained, close silence, free from the echoes of the long corridors. I made myself a cup of coffee. The simple, methodical actions a brief distraction from the terror. I leaned against the counter, the warm mug in my hands, and closed my eyes. But there was no peace. My mind was a whirlwind of paranoia. Was this silence a trick? Was something happening out there, right now, while I was hiding? Was my need for a respite putting my patients in danger? The internal conflict was unbearable. Hiding was a form of surrender, but watching was a form of madness. After only a few minutes, I couldn't stand it any longer. I had to get back to the monitors. I had to keep watch, no matter how useless it felt. I unlocked the door and stepped back out into the main corridor, my brief escape having done nothing but sharpen my anxiety. The walk back to the nurse's station was only a few dozen feet, a journey that took maybe 10 seconds. But in those 10 seconds, my world was irrevocably shattered. As I approached the desk, my eyes were drawn to a small alcove to my right. It was where the staff lockers were, small metal boxes for our personal belongings. The door to my locker, number 7, was wide open. A cold, metallic dread, heavier than anything I had felt before, seized me. I knew, with an unshakable certainty that transcended memory, that I had locked it with a key at the very start of my shift. I approached the open locker as if it were a tomb. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat a slow, painful thud. I was afraid to look inside, terrified of what I might find, or what I might not. My first scan was frantic. My wallet was there, tucked in the corner. My car keys were hanging on, their hook. A half-eaten energy bar sat on the shelf. Nothing appeared to be stolen. This wasn't a common thief. This was something infinitely worse. Then my eyes caught the first detail. On the top shelf, I kept a small, framed photograph of myself and Clara, taken on a beach trip the previous summer. It was our happiest memory, a small anchor to a sane and joyful world. The photo was still on the shelf, but it had been deliberately turned around to face the back of the locker. It was a gesture of such calculated psychological malice that it took my breath away. It was an act of intimate, personal contempt. My hands trembled as I reached in and turned the photo around. Staring at our smiling faces felt like looking at ghosts. My gaze fell back inside the locker, and that's when I saw the second thing. My spare hospital ID badge was gone. It hung on a small plastic hook next to my keys, a card that served as both my identification and my key card. The hook was empty. The card, with my face, my name, and its embedded chip granting access to nearly every door in this wing, was missing. The full weight of the violation crashed down on me. It hadn't stolen my money or my keys. It had stolen my access. It had stolen my identity. This entity, this phantom, had not only picked the lock to my personal private space, but it had selectively taken the one object that gave it absolute power within these walls. It could now walk these halls not as an intruder, but with my authority. It could open the medication closets, the supply rooms, the sky bridge doors. It could move as me. I sank to my knees before the open locker, the turned-over photograph clutched in my hand. The gifts had been messages. This was a declaration of total victory. The entity had proven it could get to my patients. It had proven it could get to my private thoughts in my logbook. And now, it had proven it could get to the very core of my identity and peel it away for its own use. I was utterly, completely, and hopelessly compromised. The fortress I had tried to build was a house of cards, and my enemy now held the master key. I had no defenses left. I had no allies. My own boss believed I was unstable, and the evidence of that instability was now in the hands of the very thing that was causing it. I was no longer a doctor. I was no longer a guard. I was a ghost in my own life, stripped of my power, my credibility, and my identity. Staring into the empty space where my keycard used to hang, I felt a despair so profound it was almost peaceful. It was the calm of absolute defeat. There was nothing left to fight. The game was over, and I had lost. I was trapped in this wing for the remainder of my shift, knowing that the thing that haunted me now wore my face and held all the keys. And, as I remained kneeling on the cold linoleum floor, I had no idea what it planned to do with its newfound freedom. I don't know how long I knelt on the cold linoleum floor, the world reduced to the empty space in my locker and the upturned photograph in my hand. Time seemed to have dissolved. The resignation was an ocean, and I was drowning in it. The silence of the annex, the crushing pressure of the deep. Every failure, every dismissal, every minor terror replayed in my mind, not as a memory, but as a final diagnosis of my own undoing. I had reached the bottom. There was no help coming. There was no one left to call, no protocol to follow. The tools of my trade, logic, observation, procedure, had proven useless, even counterproductive. They had been used as weapons against me, painting me as unstable when I was the only witness to the truth. The isolation was absolute. It was just me and the entity, locked together in this mausoleum of healing, a sick game that only one of us knew was being played. And I had lost. But in the depths of that despair, something unexpected happened. The fear, having reached its maximum saturation, could expand no further. Instead, it began to contract, to compress under its own immense pressure until it transmuted into something else. It curdled. The fear became a cold, hard rage, an incandescent fury directed not just at the thing that tormented me, but at everything that had allowed it to happen. Rage at Dr. Evans, rage at my own powerlessness, and most of all, rage at my passivity. That rage was a catalyst. It burned away the paralyzing fog of despair, leaving a sharp, cutting clarity behind. I rose to my feet, my movements no longer the shuffling of a victim, but deliberate and firm. My knee popped in protest. If I was going to be destroyed in this place, it would not be on my knees. It would not be hiding in a break room or trembling behind a desk. Fear had made me prey. Rage was going to make me a predator. A new mindset took hold. I was no longer a victim to be hunted. I was a survivor. And a survivor does not wait for the attack. A survivor adapts, thinks, and sets a trap. The entity, in its arrogance, had made a mistake. By stealing my keycard, it had, for the first time, become predictable. It had acquired a tool, and its nature would compel it to use that tool. And that gave me an advantage. I knew the capabilities of that keycard better than anyone. I knew which doors it opened. I returned to my desk, but this time it was not to document my fear in my logbook. I flipped to a clean page, and with a steady hand, began to draw, to plan. My intimate knowledge of the annex was no longer a source of terror, but my greatest asset. I knew every camera, every dead-end corridor, every forgotten supply closet. My new plan was not about defense. It was not about calling for help. It was about going on the offensive. I was going to use the annex as a weapon. I spent the next hour moving through the wing with a silent, deadly purpose. I was gathering the tools from my Gambit. From a janitor's closet, I found a roll of silver industrial duct tape and a heavy orange extension cord. From the medical supply room, I took several rolls of wide fibrous surgical tape, the kind used to immobilize limbs. My final item was a heavy, rolling oxygen tank that was nearly empty. but whose sheer weight and instability made it a perfect battering ram or barricade. My plan was simple in its design and treacherous in its execution. It centered on the west service corridor, the same place I had seen the blur on the camera. It was a long, straight stretch with only one entrance, ending in a brick wall where the older wing had been sealed off. It was a dead end, a perfect killing jar. The entity's arrogance was its weakness. It had treated me like a frightened rat. Now, I would build the maze. I had no illusions that I could physically fight this thing. Its speed and ability to go unseen made any direct confrontation suicide. My goal was not to destroy, but to contain, to expose, to trap. If I could corner it in that dead-end hall, even for a minute, I could prove its existence. I could pull a fire alarm, break a water pipe, do something so destructive that the forces of the outside world would have no choice but to come running. The rest of my shift was spent in methodical preparation. I set my trap in silence, each action precise and focused. I used the duct tape to subtly rig a closet door to swing open, creating a tripwire. I positioned the oxygen tank behind a corner, ready to be rolled out to block the passage. I no longer watched the monitors with fear, but with the cold, calculating patience of a spider waiting for its web to vibrate. The terrified doctor who had entered the annex that night was gone. In his place was a man with nothing left to lose. I had been stripped of my credibility, my peace of mind, and my very professional identity. All that was left was this cold rage and an intimate knowledge of my battlefield. I had embraced the madness of the situation, and I was ready to force a confrontation. I didn't know what form the entity would take. I didn't know its motives, but I knew it was arrogant, and I knew it now had my keycard, and sooner or later, it would use it. I sat at my station, the silence of the annex now my accomplice. The victim had become the bait in his own trap, and all I had to do now was wait for the monster to take a bite. The hours passed in a state of hyper-aware stillness. I sat at the nurse's station, a predator in my own trap, watching the monitors with a newfound purpose. The fear was still there, a cold stone in my gut, but the rage had forged it into a lens, sharpening my focus. Every flicker of static, every distant hum of the building was no longer a source of terror, but a piece of data. I was no longer waiting to be scared. I was waiting for the enemy to make a mistake, to step into the web I had so carefully laid. My trap was set in the west corridor, the long, straight hallway that terminated in a bricked-up wall. My plan relied on luring the entity into that dead end. But as the minutes stretched into hours, a new thought began to form, a question that my previous panic had obscured. Why was the entity drawn to that specific corridor in the first place? I had seen the blur of motion there. It was a dead end. There was no strategic reason to ever go down that hall, unless it wasn't a dead end at all. This new line of inquiry sparked a dangerous curiosity. Understanding the entity's territory was as important as defending my own. My trap was passive. It required the intruder to make a specific move. But what if I could find its point of origin? What if I could uncover how it moved so freely? I decided to do one final sweep, not of the whole wing, but of that specific corridor, looking at it not as a hunter, but as an architect searching for a secret door. I moved down the west corridor with a quiet, deliberate pace. The air here was colder, the dust motes dancing in the beams of the fluorescent lights. I ran my hands along the walls, feeling the texture of the old paint, the coolness of the linoleum baseboards. I reached the end. the wall of pale, mismatched bricks that sealed off the hospital's past. I pressed against it, pushed it, examining the mortar. It was solid. The secret was not here. My attention turned to the construction of the hall itself. I tapped on the wall panels, listening for any hint of hollowness. I inspected the ceiling tiles, looking for scuff marks or signs of recent movement. Nothing. It was frustrating, a dead end in every sense of the word. I was about to give up, to return to my vigil at the station, when my eyes fell upon a small, unassuming supply closet halfway down the hall. A closet I had checked before. I opened the door to the closet. It smelled of ancient dust and ammonia. It was filled with forgotten relics, rusted buckets, stiffened mops, and unlabeled bottles of cleaning solution. It was a time capsule of neglect. But this time, I wasn't looking at the contents. I was looking at the construction. My eyes scanned the back wall, and I saw it. One of the large gray floor tiles that ran a foot up the wall was slightly misaligned. The grout around it was a different color, clumsier, newer. My heart began to pound, a slow, heavy drum of excited dread. I knelt, my fingers tracing the edge of the tile. It was loose. Using the tip of a screwdriver from the small toolkit I had found, I carefully pried the tile away from the wall. It came away with a soft scraping sound, revealing not the expected, concrete foundation, but a dark, gaping void. A crude rectangular opening had been cut into the plaster and lathe behind it. A wave of stale, foul air washed over me, the breath of a long-hidden space. This was it. The secret door. This was a passage that existed on no blueprint, an artery within the hospital's walls that only my tormentor knew about. A profound sense of violation washed over me, even deeper than before. The entity wasn't just slipping through locks. It had its own private, parasitic architecture carved into the very bones of the building. With the flashlight on my phone held out before me, I took a deep breath and crawled into the darkness. The space was a narrow, dusty maintenance tunnel, barely wide enough for me to crawl on my hands and knees. Pipes and old wiring snaked along the walls. After about 20 feet, the tunnel opened into a slightly larger chamber, and what I saw there made the blood freeze in my veins. This was not just a passage. This was a lair. A filthy, worn mattress was shoved against one wall. In the corner, a small pile of food wrappers, empty water bottles, and other trash lay accumulated. It was a den, a human den. This was not a ghost or a demon. This was a person who had been living inside the walls of this hospital, perhaps for years, moving through these forgotten spaces like a termite. The revelation was horrifying. The long-term, premeditated nature of it all was more terrifying than any supernatural explanation. This was a deep, festering sickness within the hospital itself. My flashlight beam scanned across the small, squalid space, and then it fell upon the most disturbing discovery of all. Against the far wall, laid out in neat, obsessive rows, was a collection of hospital identification cards. There were dozens of them, their laminated faces staring blankly up at me. Some were modern, with color photos and magnetic strips. Others were ancient, black and white, with typed names. It was a timeline of stolen identities. And there, placed in the center of the collection, was the old black and white photograph of the severe-looking nurse from the 1960s. It was the centerpiece of this horrifying shrine. This person wasn't just hiding here. They were a collector, a connoisseur of the hospital's history, of the people who had walked its halls. They were a living, breathing archive of stolen lives. as I stood there, crouched in the dusty, suffocating darkness of the lair. My mind struggled to process the implications. Who was this person? How long had they been here? Were these IDs from people they had harmed, or were they just trophies? The questions swirled, each one more terrifying than the last. The partial revelation had only deepened the mystery into something monstrous and real. Then I heard a sound. It was faint, coming from the main annex corridor outside the closet. It was a precise electronic beat. It was the sound of a key card being held against a reader. My blood turned to ice. It was a sound I had heard in my mind 1,000 times, the sound of my stolen card. A moment later, I heard the soft mechanical click of a magnetic lock disengaging. The sound came from the direction of the sky bridge, the main entrance to the wing. My carefully laid trap in the west corridor was useless. My entire strategy was built on the assumption that the intruder was already inside the wing with me. I was wrong. It had been out, and now it was coming in for the night. It was starting its shift, just as I had started mine. I was trapped in its lair, deep within its territory. The hunter had become the hunted in the most absolute way imaginable. I flicked off my flashlight, plunging myself into total darkness. I could hear the faint squeak of shoes on the linoleum, a sound I knew so well, but this time it wasn't my own. It was approaching. The final confrontation was here, but it was not on my terms. It was on its. I was plunged into absolute darkness, the flashlight on my phone extinguished in a panic. The air in the crawl space was thick and suffocating, tasting of dust and decay. I held my breath, trying to make myself smaller, trying to merge with the shadows. The only sound was the frantic, silent scream of my own thoughts, and the soft, steady squeak of shoes on the linoleum outside. It was a sound I knew intimately, the sound of my own patrols, but now it was alien, a harbinger of my own, and my trap was a failure. I was caught in its web instead. The footsteps moved with a calm, unhurried rhythm. They weren't searching. They were beginning a routine. I heard them travel down the east corridor, the direction of the patient rooms. There was a pause, followed by the soft click of a door opening. A few moments of silence, and then the click of the door closing. It was checking on Mrs. Gable. Then the footsteps continued, stopping again. Another click. It was checking on Mr. Henderson. It was performing my rounds, a grotesque parody of my duties. This chilling ritual gave me the slimmest of opportunities. While it was occupied with the patients, its back would be turned, its attention focused. It was now or never. To be found here, in its personal den, would be a death sentence. With a slowness that was a physical agony, I began to crawl backward through the narrow, suffocating tunnel. Every scrape of my knee on the dusty floor, every rustle of my clothes sounded like a gunshot in the silence. My hands found the edge of the opening. I pushed myself through, back into the relative openness of the supply closet. My body was trembling violently, my muscles screaming from the tension. I reached for the loose tile and with shaking hands, managed to fit it back into place. It was a clumsy fit, but it would hold for a few moments. I was out of the lair, but I was still deep in enemy territory, exposed and unarmed. I needed a final bastion. There was nowhere truly safe to go. The nurse's station was a fishbowl, too open and exposed. The corridors were hunting grounds. My elaborate trap in the West Wing was now a monument to my own foolishness. Only one place remained, the break room. It had no cameras, It had a lock, flimsy as it was. It was a box within a box, my last, desperate hope for a defensible position. I peered out of the supply closet. The corridor was empty. The entity was still in the east wing. Taking a desperate chance, I slipped out of the closet and ran, my feet flying across the floor, all my previous attempts at stealth abandoned. I reached the break room door, my clumsy hands fumbling with the knob. I threw myself inside, slammed the door shut, and jabbed the small circular button on the handle, hearing the pathetic little click as the lock engaged. I pressed my back against the door, my chest heaving, trying to draw a breath that wasn't laced with dust and terror. I was trapped. I had willingly locked myself in a small, windowless room with no escape. For several minutes, there was nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing and the thumping of my heart. The silence from outside was absolute. Perhaps it hadn't heard me. Perhaps it would complete its rounds and retreat to its lair, not knowing I had discovered it. But that fragile hope was a lie. I heard the footsteps again. Closer this time. They were slow, deliberate, methodical. The intruder was finished with its rounds and had realized I was not at my station. The search had begun. I heard it move past the break room. Its footsteps, continuing down the hall, then stopping. A door handle rattled. It was checking the empty rooms, one by one, eliminating possibilities. The footsteps came back down the hall, slower now. They stopped directly outside the break room door. The silence that followed was the most terrifying moment of my life. I held my breath, my entire body rigid, my ear pressed against the cool wood of the door. I could feel its presence on the other side, a weight, a pressure in the air. Time stretched into an unbearable, silent eternity. Then, the torture began. I heard the faint plastic slide of a card being inserted into the reader on the door handle. A sharp electronic beep, followed immediately by an angry, low-pitched buzz. Access denied. A short pause. The card was removed. I heard the faint whisper of another card being selected, then inserted. Beep. Buzz. Denied again. It was trying the cards. All of them. The IDs I had seen laid out in its lair. It was methodically, patiently working its way through its collection of stolen lives, searching for the one that would open this door. The sound was a symphony of horror, a calculated act of psychological warfare. Beep. Buzz. Beep. Buzz. Each denial was a small victory that only prolonged my agony, another tick of the clock towards my doom. I don't know how many cards it tried. Dozens. With each failed attempt, my hope would flicker, only to be extinguished by the sound of the next card sliding into the slot. It was so patient. It had all the time in the world. It knew I was in here. This was the culmination of its game, the cornered rat, the locked door, and the inevitable opening. Then, the sound changed. A card slid into the slot. A single, clear, affirmative beep. It was followed not by a buzz, but by the soft, satisfying click of the lock disengaging. My own key card, my own identity, used to unlock my final sanctuary. The doorknob began to turn. In that last second, my rage, my survival instinct, took over. I had dragged the heavy oxygen tank with me in my frantic retreat, and it stood beside the door. As the door swung open, I didn't see a monster. I saw a person, gaunt, tall, their face pale and featureless in the gloom, their eyes dark voids. I screamed. a raw animal sound, and heaved the heavy metal cylinder with all my strength. There was a sickening crunch as the tank hit the figure, a crash as it slammed against the wall. The figure staggered back, letting out a pained, breathy gasp, the first and only sound I ever heard it make. It didn't try to fight back. It turned, unnaturally fast, and fled, a limping, dark shape that disappeared down the corridor, back towards the west wing, back towards its hidden lair. I stumbled out of the break room, my body screaming in pain, and pulled the nearest fire alarm. The world erupted in strobing lights and a deafening siren. Within minutes, the annex was flooded with security guards and medical staff. My story, now backed by a physical confrontation and a clearly disturbed scene, was finally, partially believed. An investigation was launched. They searched the walls, but the crawlspace, the lair, and its occupant were gone. It had vanished as completely as a ghost. I survived, but I did not win. I left my residency. I could never step foot in a hospital again. The trauma of that night is a scar that will never fade. I live with the knowledge that the entity was never caught, never identified. The sickness within the walls of St. Jude's was never cured. Sometimes, late at night, in the deepest quiet, I can still hear the faint sound of a keycard sliding into a lock. Beep. Buzz. A patient, methodical search for a door that will open, and the terrifying, lingering question of whose identity it wears now. Story 2, The Haven System. The smell of fresh paint and possibility is something I don't think I'll ever forget. It was the official scent of our new life. A clean slate in the form of a 2-story house on a quiet, tree-lined street. My partner, Liam, and I had spent years saving, dreaming of this exact moment. Standing in the empty living room, where our voices echoed in a satisfying way, felt like crossing the finish line of a marathon we'd been running our entire adult lives. This wasn't just a house. It was a testament to our future, a container for all the life we were about to live. We had bought the house from a couple who were relocating overseas in a hurry. They'd left behind more than just the faint scent of their own lives. They'd left behind the house's brain. The entire home was wired with something called the Haven System, a state-of-the-art smart home network from a few years back. The realtor had presented it as a major bonus, and at the time, it felt like winning the lottery. Lights, thermostats, speakers, cameras, and locks, all connected and controllable by voice or phone. It felt impossibly futuristic and luxurious. Our first few days were a blur of unpacking boxes, ordering pizza, and sleeping on a mattress on the floor, too tired and happy to care. We learned the house's quirks, the way the late afternoon sun slanted through the big bay window, the soft groan of the pipes when the shower was on, and we learned Haven. "Haven, turn on the kitchen lights," Liam would call out, his voice filled with childish glee as the room instantly flooded with light. It was our magical, obedient ghost. The system was incredibly intuitive. We linked our phones within an hour, marveling at the ability to adjust the temperature from miles away, or check the front door camera feed while sitting on the couch. It felt like the pinnacle of security and convenience. We felt so safe, so protected by our new, intelligent home. The previous owners had left us a simple one-page printout with the basic voice commands and the Wi-Fi password, and for us, that was more than enough. We were home. Liam was the tech enthusiast, a man who loved gadgets and the sleek promise of an easier future. He spent an entire evening setting up music playlists to stream through the nearly invisible speakers embedded in the ceilings of each room. Haven, "Play our unwinding playlist in the living room," he commanded, and the soft notes of our favorite indie folk band would begin to drift through the air. It was perfect. Our own personal soundtrack for building a life together. My own joy was simpler. I loved the sense of permanence. After years of renting apartments with paper-thin walls and indifferent landlords, owning these thick, solid walls felt like a miracle. I loved walking barefoot on the cool hardwood floors and planning where our furniture would go. I pictured hosting holiday dinners, watching our future kids run through the small backyard. This house was not just a structure. It was the empty frame around which we would paint our masterpiece of a life. The Haven system quickly became an integral part of our routine. The lights would gradually brighten in the morning to wake us up gently. When we'd say, "Haven, we're leaving," the system would lock all the doors, adjust the thermostat to save energy, and arm the security cameras. It was seamless. We trusted it implicitly. It was the silent, efficient butler we never knew we needed, making every aspect of our lives feel just a little bit easier, a little more polished. We felt a strange sort of gratitude towards the previous owners for leaving it behind. It must have cost a fortune to install. We imagined them as a sophisticated, forward-thinking couple who had simply moved on to their next adventure, leaving their digital ghost behind to care for us. The house had a history, but the Haven system made it feel brand new, wiped clean, and customized just for our needs. We were its new masters, and it obeyed our every command without question. Liam and I would often joke about how lazy we were becoming. "I almost forgot how to use a light switch," he'd laugh, as we'd lie in bed and tell Haven to turn off the lights. The house felt responsive, alive in a way, but entirely under our control. It was our creation, our sanctuary. The cameras provided a sense of impenetrable security. The automated locks a promise of safety. We slept more soundly those first few weeks than we had in years. The neighborhood was as perfect as the house. Quiet, suburban, with friendly neighbors who would wave as they walked their dogs. It was the kind of idyllic setting you see in movies, a place where nothing bad could ever happen. Our little home, with its smart technology and fresh paint, was our castle in this peaceful kingdom. We were insulated from the noise and chaos of the outside world, cocooned in our own private, perfect bubble. I remember one evening, about a week after we moved in, sitting on the living room floor with Liam, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes. We were eating takeout from paper containers, and he had told Haven to dim the lights to a soft, warm glow. "You know," I said, looking around the room, "I think this is the happiest I've ever been." He smiled, and in that moment, under the gentle, automated lighting of our smart home, I felt a profound sense of peace. The system had no personality, of course. Its voice was a generic, pleasant female alto, the default setting for most digital assistants. It was polite, efficient, and utterly devoid of character. She was just Haven, a utility, a tool. She would confirm our commands with a placid, "Certainly," or "As you wish." The predictability was part of the comfort. It was a stable, reliable presence in our new lives. We talked about the future, about painting the spare bedroom, about planting a garden in the spring. All our plans were tied to this place, to these walls. The house was already becoming a part of us, its digital nervous system intertwining with our own daily habits. We couldn't imagine living without the convenience of it now. It had so quickly and seamlessly integrated itself into the fabric of our existence. We never once questioned the deeper mechanics of the system. We were the users, not the administrators. We didn't know or care about the underlying code, the master accounts, or the digital architecture. Why would we? It worked. It did what we asked. The complex web of servers and software that ran our home was invisible to us, and we were content to keep it that way. Our trust was absolute because our experience was flawless. On that first weekend, after a long day of unpacking, Liam put on a movie. "Haven, movie mode," he said. The lights dimmed to a cinematic low. The smart blinds slowly lowered over the windows and the sound system rumbled to life. I curled up next to him on our new couch, feeling an overwhelming sense of contentment. We were safe, we were happy, and we were in complete control of our environment. This was our normal. A young couple, a new house, and a piece of technology that promised to make life perfect. The initial phase of our life here was defined by this profound sense of order and security. Every door was locked. Every light was exactly as we wanted it. Every sound was one we had personally selected. The house was our echo, reflecting our desires back at us with perfect fidelity. It was a fragile, beautiful illusion. We had mistaken control of the light switches for control of the house itself. We believed we were the masters of this digital kingdom, but we had never even met the king. We were living in a house that was still listening for its old master's voice, and we were about to learn that our commands were merely suggestions, easily overridden. The peace was not meant to last. The magic of the first few weeks slowly settled into the comfortable rhythm of everyday life. Most of the boxes were gone, replaced by our own furniture, our own art, our own clutter. The Haven system was no longer a novelty, but a seamless part of our domestic landscape. We had programmed it to brew our coffee in the morning and to warm the house just before we got home from work. It was the invisible engine that kept our new life running smoothly, and we had started to take its flawless performance for granted. The first sign that something was amiss was so small, so trivial, that I almost didn't register it. I was working from home one Tuesday, hunched over my laptop at the dining room table. The house was completely silent except for the click of my keyboard. From the living room, Haven's placid voice suddenly spoke, clear and distinct. "I'm sorry," it said. "I don't have an answer for that." I froze, my fingers hovering over the keys. Liam was at the office. I hadn't said a word. A strange prickle of confusion ran through me. I got up and walked into the living room, half expecting to find the television on, or something that could have triggered the voice activation. But the room was still and empty, exactly as I had left it. I chalked it up to a fluke, a stray sound from outside that the system had misinterpreted as a command. It was a machine, after all. Machines make mistakes. I put it out of my mind and went back to work. Later that week, Liam and I were making dinner together. He was chopping vegetables, while I stirred a pot on the stove. The kitchen filled with the warm, savory smell of garlic and onions. The kitchen lights, which we had turned on via voice command an hour earlier, suddenly blinked out, plunging us into darkness for a full second before flickering back on. "Whoa," Liam said with a laugh. "That was weird." I agreed, my heart giving. A little jump of surprise. "Must be a loose wire in the switch," he concluded, already returning to his chopping. "It's an old house after all. The wiring is probably not perfectly synced up with all this new tech." It made perfect sense. The explanation was simple, logical, and reassuring. It was a problem with the house's old bones, not its new brain. We finished making dinner and didn't give the incident another thought. dismissing it as a trivial quirk of our new home. The anomalies, however, began to feel slightly more specific. A few nights later, I was woken from a deep sleep by a single, sharp sound. It was a musical note, a discordant clang from a piano that seemed to come directly from the Haven speaker on my nightstand. It was loud and sudden in the dead quiet of the night. I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart racing. Liam mumbled something and rolled over, completely undisturbed. The room was silent again. I stayed awake for nearly an hour, listening. There was nothing. I told myself I must have dreamt it, or that it was a notification sound from my phone that sounded strange in my sleepy state. I didn't want to wake Liam and sound crazy over what was probably nothing. I was so fiercely protective of our new happiness, our new peace, that I was willing to edit out the small inconsistencies, to smooth over the cracks before he could even see them. Liam had his own strange encounter with the system's quirks a few days later. He was trying to get Haven to play a specific album by a band he loved. "Haven, play Helios by the Augustines," he said. The system replied, "Certainly, playing Helios by the Augustines," but then proceeded to play a completely different song, a somber instrumental piano piece we'd never heard before. He tried again, enunciating clearly. The same thing happened. The same sad, unfamiliar piano music filled the room. "What is wrong with this thing?" he muttered in frustration, finally overriding it with his phone. The music recognition must be completely shot. He theorized that the previous owners had a bizarrely named playlist and the system was getting confused, pulling from a corrupted or poorly labeled data pool. It was another bug, another amusing flaw in our otherwise perfect digital butler. We laughed about its terrible taste in music. The glitches, however, started to stray from amusing to slightly unnerving. One morning, as I was leaving for a meeting, I performed our usual ritual. "Haven, I'm leaving," I called out from the hallway. I heard the satisfying click of the front and back door locks engaging. But as I sat in my car, about to pull out of the driveway, my phone buzzed with a notification from the Haven app. It read, "Alert, front door unlocked." My stomach tightened. I opened the app, and sure enough, the icon for the front door lock was red, showing it as unlocked. I could see the live camera feed of my own empty porch. From the app, I tapped the lock icon and heard, faintly from the house, the sound of the deadbolt sliding back into place. It was the first time the system had failed at a security task. I tried to reason it away. Maybe I'd spoken too quickly. Maybe I had accidentally unlocked it from the app myself, but a cold seed of doubt was planted. That evening, I mentioned the series of small incidents to Liam, the voice talking to no one, the flickering lights, the door unlocking itself. I tried to keep my tone light, as if I were listing amusing anecdotes. He listened, his brow furrowed in thought. As the tech optimist, he had an explanation for everything. It was a complex system, probably running on outdated software that the previous owners had never updated. It needed a tune-up. "It's like an old car," he said, putting his arm around me. "You just have to learn its personality, figure out where to jiggle the wires." He promised he would spend some time on Saturday looking for an online user manual or a forum for Haven system owners. He was sure there was a simple fix, probably a master reboot sequence for the central hub that would clear out all the bugs and corrupted data. His confidence was reassuring. Of course, that was it. The system was just buggy. It wasn't sinister. It was just poorly maintained. We were dealing with technological decay, not a malicious presence. We agreed that a full reboot was the right course of action. We had a plan. We had a logical explanation. We were still in control of the situation. But as we fell asleep that night, I couldn't shake a lingering sense of unease. The house felt different. The silence was no longer entirely peaceful. It now seemed to be listening. Each of the glitches, taken alone, was insignificant. But when strung together, they started to form a pattern, a series of questions that my rational mind was working harder and harder to ignore. Our perfect home wasn't perfect anymore. It had flaws. We had fallen in love with the idea of a home that was an extension of our will, a place that responded to our every command. But the commands were starting to get lost in translation. It felt like we were speaking to a machine that was slowly developing a mind of its own, with its own strange, melancholy taste in music, and a clumsy, intermittent grasp of its own functions. Tamal, foundation of our trust in the system, once a solid bedrock, now had a network of tiny hairline fractures. We believed a reboot would fix them, would seal the cracks, and make everything perfect again. We couldn't have been more wrong. We weren't dealing with bugs in a machine. We were dealing with features that had been designed by someone else, for a purpose we couldn't yet begin to imagine. The glitches weren't the system failing. They were the system working perfectly. That Saturday, Liam dedicated himself to becoming the master of our disobedient house. He found the Haven system's central hub, a sleek black box covered in blinking blue lights, tucked away on a shelf in the basement closet. With his laptop open, he set about his mission to perform a full factory reset, to wipe the slate clean and purge the ghost from our machine. I watched him with a hopeful optimism, convinced that his technical savvy would conquer the few remaining bugs and restore our home to its former perfection. His confidence, however, began to slowly erode over the next few hours. The Haven system, it turned out, was a digital fortress. He found online forums filled with complaints from other users. The system was notoriously locked down, and a full reset or a change of administrative ownership was impossible without the original master, account credentials, and a proprietary software key, information we simply did not have. The previous owners had left us the user password, but not the keys to the kingdom. He tried every trick he could find online, inputting backdoor codes and attempting to force a reboot by cutting and restoring power in a specific sequence. The system was implacable. It seemed to reject his every attempt, its blue lights blinking with a steady, indifferent rhythm. "It's like it's actively fighting me," he said, his voice tight with frustration as he finally leaned back from the hub. "Everything is walled off. I can't get access to the core controls." We were locked out of our own home's brain. Defeated, we decided to abandon the effort for the weekend. We would call a certified installer on Monday. It was a more expensive solution, but it seemed the only one left. We resolved to simply live with the quirks for a couple more days. The flickering lights and random voice activations were annoying, but not dangerous. We reassured ourselves that a professional would have this all sorted out in no time. We were wrong. We had underestimated the problem entirely. That night, the true escalation began. I was woken at 3 a.m. by music. It wasn't a single sharp note this time, but a fully formed melody. It was the same sad, simple piano piece that the system had mistakenly played for Liam days earlier, now seeping from the speaker on our nightstand at a low, mournful volume. It played on a continuous loop, a haunting, melancholy lullaby that filled the dark room with a profound sense of sorrow. Liam sat up, wide awake instantly. The annoyance on his face was gone, replaced by a deep and genuine concern. He grabbed his phone from the nightstand, his fingers frantically tapping on the screen to shut the music off. The silence that rushed back in was heavy and oppressive. We looked at each other in the darkness, the unspoken question hanging in the air between us. How had that happened? We hadn't used the speakers all day. Just as the silence began to feel normal again, an intense, penetrating chill began to fill the room. It was a sudden, unnatural cold, the kind that sinks right into your bones. I pulled the comforter up to my chin, shivering. I could see my own breath misting in the faint moonlight filtering through the window. What the hell? Liam whispered, grabbing his phone again. The screen cast a pale blue light on his face, his eyes wide with disbelief. It's set to 50 degrees. He showed me the screen. The Haven app clearly showed the thermostat had been manually set to its lowest possible temperature. He quickly swiped his finger across the screen, cranking it back up to a normal 70 degrees. A moment later, we heard the distant rumble of the furnace kicking on. But the comfort of the returning warmth was completely overshadowed by the chilling implications of the act. The system was now manipulating our physical environment in a way that felt openly hostile. We barely slept for the rest of the night, lying stiffly in bed, listening to every creak and groan of the house. The feeling of being safe, of being in control, was completely gone. When morning finally came, I went downstairs first, desperate for the comfort of a hot cup of coffee and the reassuring light of day. But the kitchen was cold, and as my eyes adjusted, I saw why. The back door, the one that led out into our small, fenced-in yard, was standing wide open. I froze at the bottom of the stairs, my hand flying to my mouth. We were meticulous about security. The Haven Goodnight command was the last thing we said every single night, a ritual that locked every door and armed the system. I had heard the familiar click of the deadbolt engaging myself just hours before. And yet, here it was, open to the cold morning air. This was the final, undeniable piece of evidence. This was the end of all rationalizations. "Liam!" I screamed, my voice thin and reedy with panic. He came running down the stairs, his face pale with lack of sleep. He saw the open door and stopped dead, his brief hope that I was overreacting vanishing in an instant. We stood there together, staring at the open doorway. A software bug doesn't slide a deadbolt. A faulty wire doesn't turn a door handle. This was a physical act, an intrusion. All of our comforting explanations felt like pathetic, childish fantasies in that moment. It wasn't a glitch. It wasn't a bug. It wasn't a power surge. It was something intelligent. It was something deliberate. And it had either been inside our house, or it had the power to manipulate our house from the outside as if it were. Both possibilities were equally terrifying. For the first time, we were truly, deeply afraid. We spent the next hour in a frantic state of high alert. We manually checked every window and every lock in the house, trusting our own hands and eyes over the app on our phones. We unplugged the Haven speaker in our bedroom and the one in the living room, an act that felt like trying to blind a monster that could still see. The house was no longer a sanctuary. It was compromised. The fear was a living thing now, a third presence in our home. It sat with us at the breakfast table. It watched us from the shadowy corners of every room. We didn't know how this was happening, or who was behind it, but the what was becoming terrifyingly clear. The complex, convenient system that we had so admired, the digital brain of our home, was working against us. It was actively trying to make us uncomfortable, to make us cold, to make us afraid. the melancholy lullaby that played in the dead of night no longer felt like a random piece of music. It felt like a message. It was a song of mourning, and we were beginning to feel as though it was being played for us. Our dream home had become a cage, and the bars were made of our own technology. We were trapped, living inside a machine that had turned on us. We had no control, and now, no more denial to hide behind. The house was awake, it was active, and it felt like it was watching us, waiting for its next opportunity to remind us that we were not the ones in charge. The battle for our home had begun, and we had no idea who we were fighting. The weekend passed in a fog of anxiety. We existed in our new home like trespassers, our conversation reduced to hushed whispers, our movements cautious and deliberate. Every creak of the floorboards, every hum from an appliance, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through us. We had unplugged the main speakers in the living room and our bedroom, a small, futile gesture of defiance. But the Haven system was the house's circulatory system. We couldn't cut it out without killing the home itself. The lights, the locks, the climate, it was all still listening. For 2 days, nothing happened. The silence was absolute, unbroken by phantom lullabies or sudden temperature drops. A fragile, tentative hope began to take root. Perhaps the system, in its bizarre cascade of failures, had finally burned itself out. Perhaps unplugging the primary speakers had severed some crucial connection. We desperately wanted to believe that the worst was over, that we had weathered the storm, and could now begin the slow process of feeling safe again in our own home. By Monday, a thin veneer of normalcy had returned. Liam went to work, and I opted to work from home, still feeling too unsettled to leave the house unattended. The idea of it being empty, vulnerable to whatever had been tormenting us, was unbearable. I tried to build a cocoon of safety around myself. I didn't speak to Haven. I used a small portable Bluetooth speaker to play my own music, a bubble of familiar sound in the tense quiet. I was determined to have a normal, productive day. I was immersed in a project, my focus narrowed to the screen of my laptop. The soft rock music from my small speaker a comforting presence. Mid-song, the music abruptly stopped. I looked at the speaker, assuming its battery had died. The sudden silence that filled the room was jarring and total. It felt heavier than mere quiet. It was a vacuum, a void where sound used to be. I sat perfectly still, my ears straining, every nerve ending on high alert. Then, from the living room, a soft sound began. It was a low, static hiss, the sound of an open audio channel emanating from the main Haven speaker, the one we had unplugged. My blood ran cold. How was it even on? The hissing grew slightly in volume, a grainy, expectant sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. It felt like the sound of something taking a slow, deep breath before speaking. I was frozen at the dining table, unable to move, unable to look away from the empty doorway to the living room. Through the static, a voice spoke. It was not Haven's synthetic, pleasant female tone. This was a whisper, a dry, raspy, and distinctly masculine whisper, digitized and distorted as if being filtered through layers of faulty software. It was a horrifying, intimate sound, and it spoke a single word, a word that shattered the last remnants of my composure and plunged me into the depths of pure terror. It whispered my name. Maya. It was a violation on a cellular level. The house, this entity, this ghost in the machine, knew my name. It It had plucked it from the air and whispered it back to me. This wasn't a random glitch. This wasn't a pre-recorded remnant from a previous owner. This was direct, personal, and it was happening right now. It was an acknowledgement that I was being watched, that I was the specific target of this torment. The anonymity of the haunting was gone, replaced by a terrifying, targeted intimacy. I scrambled back from the table, my chair screeching against the hardwood floor and tipping over. With a loud crash, my breath came in ragged, panicked gasps. My eyes were locked on the silent, menacing speaker in the other room. It felt like a predator's eye, a mouth that had just spoken and could speak again at any moment. The house was no longer a compromised space. It was an active participant in my terror, an accomplice to the voice that had called my name. My first coherent thought was of Liam. I needed to hear his voice. I needed another human to confirm that I wasn't going insane, that this was real. My hands were shaking so violently that I dropped my phone twice before I could unlock it. I fumbled through my contacts, my thumb repeatedly missing his name. When I finally managed to press the call button, I could barely form words. It talked to me. I sobbed into the phone when he answered, my voice a frantic, breathless mess. Liam. It said my name. He was confused at first, trying to calm me down, asking me to speak slowly, but the raw, undiluted panic in my voice must have cut through. He didn't need to understand the details to know that something was terribly, terribly wrong. He just kept saying my name, telling me he was on his way, that he was leaving work, right now. I ended the call and retreated to the furthest corner of the dining room, pulling my knees to my chest. I couldn't take my eyes off the living room speaker. I felt like a child, hiding from a monster that I knew was real. The silence that had returned was worse than the whisper itself. It was filled with the echo of my name, a word that now felt alien and tainted. It had been weaponized against me. The house felt enormous and threatening. Every shadow was a potential hiding place. Every small sound was a prelude to another violation. I was a prisoner in my own home, under surveillance, by an entity that knew me, that could control my environment, and that could speak to me whenever it chose. The last vestiges of my denial, my hope that this could be explained away, were utterly destroyed. I waited for Liam, huddled on the floor, for what felt like an eternity. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I just watched the silent speaker, my entire being coiled in a state of terror. This was a turning point. The entity was no longer just a poltergeist, a series of glitches and strange occurrences. It had a voice. It had a target. And its target was me. This was the end of the beginning. The subtle infestation was over, and a new phase of our nightmare had begun. The entity was no longer content to just pull the levers of the house from behind the curtain. It had stepped out onto the stage, if only for a single terrifying word. It had made the threat personal. And as I sat there, shaking in the silent house, I knew that this was only the start of its game. The real horror was just beginning. Liam found me exactly where I had huddled on the floor, a trembling ball of fear in the corner of the dining room. He didn't try to rationalize or explain it away this time. The terror in my eyes was proof enough that what I had experienced was real. He simply held me, his own fear a palpable tension in his arms. The whisper had changed everything. It had crossed a line, transforming the threat from an impersonal series of malfunctions into a targeted, personal assault. We were no longer dealing with a faulty house. We were dealing with an intruder. That shared fear became a strange source of strength. After the initial shock began to subside, it was replaced by a grim, shared determination. We were not going to be terrorized out of our own home, the place we had poured all our dreams and savings into. We were going to fight back. The conversation we had that evening was not about moving out or calling the police again. It was a strategy session, a council of war held in hushed tones at our own kitchen table, as if the walls themselves were listening. Our first decision was to blind our enemy. If we were being watched and listened to, we would take away its eyes and ears. We found a roll of black electrical tape in a toolbox and began a systematic sweep of the house. We placed a small, dark square over the lens of every Haven camera, the one on the porch, the one in the living room, the one in the upstairs hallway. It was a crude, almost childish solution to a high-tech problem, but it felt like a necessary act of rebellion. Next, we went after the speakers. We unplugged every single Haven device we could find, pulling their power cords from the walls with a satisfying finality. We could no longer be certain which ones were truly inactive, so we treated them all as hostile. We were effectively devoicing our home, forcing it back into a state of silence. We would provide our own soundtrack from now on. We were severing the lines of communication, one plug at a time, creating small pockets of digital silence. We fundamentally changed how we lived in the house overnight. The convenience we had once reveled in was now a vulnerability we had to avoid. We stopped using voice commands completely, speaking to each other in low voices, constantly aware that the microphones might still be active. We started using light, switches again, the simple, manual click, a small act of defiance. We were consciously unsyncing ourselves from the home's network, treating our own modern amenities as if they were poison. Our bedroom became our last bastion, the only place. We felt we could have some semblance of privacy. We wedged a heavy rubber doorstop under the door each night, a physical barrier to supplement the smart lock we no longer trusted. Sleep was fitful, haunted by a new kind of paranoia. We were living like fugitives in our own home, constantly, looking over our shoulders, questioning every sound, every flicker of light. The dream of a convenient, automated life had become a waking nightmare. While I focused on our physical defenses, Liam launched a digital counteroffensive. He spent hours hunched over his laptop, not just browse help forums anymore, but diving into the darker corners of the internet. He researched cybersecurity forums and hacker websites, searching for known exploits for the Haven system's architecture. He was no longer a frustrated user trying to reboot a buggy device. He was a homeowner trying to repel a digital invasion, learning the language of his enemy. He learned about persistent rootkits, malicious programs that could survive reboots and hide deep within a system's core operating files. He read about how master administrator accounts could be hidden or cloned, allowing someone to maintain access even after user-level passwords were changed. He was starting to understand the terrifying possibility that the previous owner hadn't, just left the system for us. He had left himself a permanent, invisible backdoor into our lives. The research consumed him. He was a man possessed, driven by a need to protect me, to protect our home. His tech optimism had been burned away, replaced by a cynical and focused determination. He saw the system not as a tool, but as a compromised network, and he was hunting for the breach. He downloaded diagnostic software, running scans that took hours, searching for any file, any process that didn't belong. After 2 days of relentless work, he found a potential vulnerability. It wasn't in the Haven system itself, which was too well defended, but in the way it communicated with our network. He found a complex workaround that would allow him to blacklist the Haven Hub's unique MAC address from our Wi-Fi router's control panel. It was a drastic move. It would effectively sever the entire house from the internet, turning all its smart features into useless plastic and wires. With a grim sense of finality, we decided to do it. Liam navigated to the router's administrative page, his fingers flying, across the keyboard. He located the Haven Hub on the list of connected devices, and, with a final click, blocked it. We watched the blinking blue lights on the hub flicker for a moment, and then one of them turned a solid, angry red. It was disconnected. We had cut the cord. A profound sense of relief washed over us. It felt like we had just won a major battle. The house was dumb now. The locks were just locks. The lights were just lights. The thermostat was just a thermostat. The silence was no longer menacing. It was just silence, pure and simple. We had performed a digital exorcism, casting the ghost out of our machine by starving it of the connection. It needed to survive. That night, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, we slept soundly. We had fought back, and we had won. The doorstop was still wedged under the door, a reminder of the battle, but it felt more like a trophy now than a defense. We had successfully isolated the threat, cut it off from its source of power, and reclaimed our home. We believed we were safe. We allowed ourselves to relax, to breathe again. We started to feel like homeowners instead of hostages. The house felt like ours once more. We had faced the unknown, the terrifying, and we had found a solution. Through our own ingenuity and resolve, we had stared into the digital abyss and had been the ones to pull the plug, silencing the whisper in the static. This newfound peace, however, was as fragile as a pane of glass. We had made the critical mistake of assuming our enemy's power came only from the outside world, through the invisible tether of the internet. We didn't yet understand the true nature of the system. We had blocked the front door, but the intruder had been living in the house the entire time, embedded in its very memory. Our victory was an illusion, and our brief respite was about to be shattered. For 2 blissful days, the house was silent. It was a true, deep, and uncomplicated silence that we soaked in like a healing balm. We lived a proudly analog life within our high-tech home, flipping light switches and turning physical keys in, our own doors. The red light on the Haven Hub in the basement was a beacon of our victory. We had faced down the ghost in our machine and severed its connection to our world. We spoke openly, we laughed loudly, and we began to finally feel the simple, uncomplicated joy of homeownership again. The peace was a beautiful, fragile lie. The illusion shattered on a Wednesday afternoon. I was working alone in the upstairs office when I came downstairs for a glass of water. As I entered the living room, I stopped dead. The large television, which had been off, was now on. It was silent, but the screen was glowing, displaying a slow, elegant slideshow of photographs. My photographs, pictures from my private, password-protected cloud account. My heart hammered against my ribs. I saw a picture of Liam and me on a beach in Mexico, squinting in the sun. Then one of my college graduation, my arm slung around my best friend. Then a candid photo of my parents at their anniversary, dinner a few years ago. Photos I had not looked at in years, stored away in the digital attic of my life, were now being projected in a silent, looping display in the heart of my home. I had never, ever linked that account to the Haven Systems television app, Frantically, I pulled out my phone, my fingers shaking as I opened the Wi-Fi router's admin panel. The page loaded, confirming my worst fears. The Haven hub was still blocked. Its MAC address was still on the blacklist. The house should have no possible way of connecting to the internet to access a cloud-based photo server. It was impossible. Unless the connection was never the source of its power, unless the photos had been downloaded and stored long ago, waiting to be deployed. As I stood there, reeling from the implications, trying to wrap my mind around how this was happening, a new sound began. It was a sharp, mechanical sound from the front hallway. Click, clack. I recognized it instantly. It was the smart lock on the front door. The deadbolt was sliding open, then immediately sliding shut again. Click, clack. It repeated the action with a steady, rhythmic cadence. It wasn't a malfunction. It was a taunt. I crept towards the hallway and peered around the corner. The lock on the front door was cycling, over and over. Unlocked. Locked. Unlocked. Locked. It was a deliberate, mocking display of power. It was a direct response to our efforts. A message that our attempts to control the house were futile. The entity didn't need the internet to control the most vital security component of our home. It was already inside the local network, inside the very walls. I called Liam, my voice a strained, terrified whisper. "It's back," I said. "It's in the house. It's not gone." He came home in record time, his face pale and grim. He found me standing, in the living room, staring at the still cycling slideshow of my life, while the front door lock continued its rhythmic, mocking dance. He saw the defeat and terror in my eyes, and knew our victory had been a fantasy. He immediately went to the TV and unplugged it from the wall, plunging the room into silence, save for the lock. As he was trying to figure out how to disable the lock mechanism without breaking it, the rhythmic clicking suddenly stopped. A heavy silence descended once more. We stood together in the living room, a new and more profound despair settling over us. And then I felt it. A familiar, creeping chill. "Liam," I whispered. "It's cold." He walked over to the thermostat on the wall, its small screen glowing. "It's set to 64, he said, his voice flat with disbelief. The number didn't mean anything to him. It was just a random, chilly temperature. But for me, it was a lightning strike. 64 degrees. I felt a wave of nausea so intense I had to steady myself against the wall. I grabbed Liam's arm, pulling him towards my laptop on the dining table. My hands trembled as I typed, navigating to my old, archived emails. I found the one I was looking for, a message from the hospice care facility. My mother's room. I showed the screen to Liam. The mandated temperature for her climate-controlled room had been 64 degrees. This changed everything. This was no longer a hacker or a tech-savvy ghost of a previous owner playing tricks. This was something that knew me. This was information that wasn't on any social media profile, not something that could be gleaned from watching the house. This was a detail buried in my private emails, tied to the most painful memory of my life. The entity, whatever it was, had access to my deepest, most private digital footprint. The implications were staggering. It meant it had been watching me for a long, long time. It had been reading my emails, looking at my private photos, learning my history. It was a digital stalker of the most invasive kind, an invisible, omniscient presence that had cataloged my life and was now using my own grief as a weapon. The feeling of violation was absolute, a spiritual sickness that went far beyond a hacked device. The slideshow of my life on the television now seemed horribly sinister. It wasn't a random selection. It was a curated display of my past, a demonstration of how much it knew. The unlocked door wasn't just a taunt. It was a promise that no barrier, physical or digital, could keep it out. And the temperature, that specific, cruel number, was its masterpiece. It was a signature, a personal message of psychological torture. We were utterly helpless. Our attempts to fight back had been pathetic. We had cut off the internet, and it had laughed at us, revealing that its control was far deeper, stored locally within the system's own memory. It didn't need to be online. It had everything it needed right here. It had all of my data. It had all of my memories. We huddled together on the couch, the house now feeling like a tomb. It was a coffin built around us, a smart tomb that knew every single one of my weaknesses. The entity wasn't just a ghost in the machine anymore. It was a parasite that had burrowed into my life, and it was clear now that it wasn't just trying to scare us. It was trying to break me. And for the first time, I felt like it might actually succeed. The revelation of the thermostat, the chilling significance of that single cruel number, plunged us into a new depth of despair. The fight was no longer about our home. It was about my life, my memories. The intruder wasn't just a hacker. They were a biographer of my pain, a curator of my grief. We spent the night huddled together on the couch, too afraid to sleep in our own bed, feeling as if the very air in the house was poisoned with a hostile, intimate knowledge of me. We knew we couldn't go on like this. We had to try to find help again. Our first call the next morning was to the company that manufactured the Haven system. This time, we were armed with more than just a story about glitches. We had a specific, terrifying narrative of cyberstalking and personal data breaches. After navigating a labyrinthine automated phone menu, we were finally connected to a customer service representative. I tried to explain the situation calmly, detailing how the system was being controlled offline and accessing my private, cloud-based data without authorization. The representative on the other end of the line was polite and followed his script perfectly. He expressed his concern, but his hands were tied. "Ma'am, I understand your distress," he said in a placid, unhelpful tone. "But in order to access the system's administrative logs or perform a remote diagnostic, we need verification from the registered master account holder." He was, in other words, asking for permission from the very person who was tormenting us. Our names were on the deed to the house, but not on the digital deed to its brain. We pleaded with him, explaining that the previous owner was the likely source of the problem. We asked for their contact information, for any way to reach them, to request a transfer of ownership. The answer was a firm corporate no. Due to privacy policies, we are legally prohibited from sharing the personal information of any current or former client, he recited, his voice unchanging. We were trapped in a bureaucratic nightmare, stonewalled by the very privacy laws that should have been protecting me. Our next frantic call was to the real estate agent who had sold us the house. We left a rambling, desperate voicemail, and to her credit, she called us back within the hour. Her voice was sympathetic, but she had little to offer. The sale had been managed by a corporate relocation firm on behalf of her clients, who had already moved to Europe. She had no direct contact number, only an email address for the relocation company. Another door had been firmly closed in our face. With official channels exhausted, our last resort was the police. We had avoided it after our first humiliating attempt, but now we felt we had no choice. We filed a report online, carefully phrasing it as a case of cyberstalking and harassment. An officer came to the house that afternoon, a tired-looking man whose expression already showed he was expecting a waste of his time. We invited him in, the house behaving with perfect, mocking innocence around us. We showed him the thermostat, now set to a normal temperature. We showed him the blank TV screen where my private life had been displayed hours before. I tried to explain the chilling significance of 64 degrees, my voice cracking with emotion. I could see in his eyes how it sounded. A grieving daughter, under stress from a new mortgage, projecting her trauma onto a faulty appliance. He was patient, but dismissive. "Folks, what you have here is a lot of complicated tech," he said finally, closing his notepad. "Without any active threat, or any proof that your data was accessed, there's not much we can do. There's no sign of forced entry. My advice? Hire a private cybersecurity consultant. This is a civil matter, not a criminal one." He left us with a pamphlet on online safety, and a palpable sense of pity. We hadn't just failed to get help. We had reinforced the narrative that we were unstable, defeated and feeling utterly hopeless. I reached out to my best friend Sarah later that day. I needed an ally, someone who knew me, who would believe me no matter how insane it sounded. But as I told her the story over the phone, I could hear the doubt in her voice, couched in a deep layer of concern for me. A haunted smart home? A digital stalker who knew the temperature of my mother's hospital room? It sounded like the plot of a movie, not something that happens in a quiet suburban neighborhood. "Maya, are you sure you and Liam are okay?" she asked, gently, her voice full of worried affection that felt like a knife twisting. "You've been under so much stress with the move. Maybe you just need a break, a weekend away to clear your heads." Her refusal to believe the facts was worse than the officer's professional skepticism. She believed in me, but she believed I was unwell, that I was a victim of my own mind, not of an intruder. That was the moment I understood the true, perfect nature of the prison our tormentor had built. The harassment was so specific, so personal, and so technologically esoteric that it was impossible to prove. The evidence was emotional, ephemeral. It existed in my memory, in my grief, but left no fingerprints. The entity had found a way to attack us that made us the primary suspects in our own madness. Our isolation was now complete. We were alone. We had been dismissed by the corporation that built the system, the police force sworn to protect us, and the friends we relied on for support. We were adrift in our own home, which had become a hostile island. There would be no cavalry. There would be no expert coming to the rescue. The world outside our front door had deemed us unreliable narrators of our own story. That night, the silence in the house was different again. It was the silence of total isolation. We sat together in the living room, the quiet pressing in on us, knowing that we had no one to turn to but each other. The unseen landlord of our home had not only taken control of our environment, they had successfully severed us from the rest of the world, leaving us alone in the dark with them. The house was a paradox, a place where we were under constant, invasive surveillance, yet completely invisible to anyone who could help. The walls didn't just have ears and eyes. They were a barrier, insulating our tormentor from scrutiny, protecting him from the consequences of his actions. We were trapped, not just in a house, but in a nightmare that no one else believed was real. A quiet, gnawing dread became the new soundtrack to our lives. We had to go to work, had to pay the mortgage on the very house that was tormenting us. Leaving it each morning felt like an act of surrender, like we were abandoning our home to a hostile occupying force. The drive to our respective offices was filled with a tense silence, both of us lost in our own private loops of fear. Conversation had shifted from, how do we fix this, to the terrifying unspoken question, how do we get out? The house did not let us forget its power, even when we were away. That morning, sitting at my desk, my phone buzzed with a notification from the Haven app. Alert. Living room camera view obstructed. I stared at the message, my heart sinking. The black electrical tape we had so carefully placed over the lens. A few minutes later, another notification arrived. Alert. Obstruction cleared. I didn't need to see the feed to know what it meant. It was a demonstration, a casual display of power. It was telling us that our physical defenses were as meaningless as our digital ones. The rest of the day was a study in controlled panic. I found it impossible to focus on my work, my mind constantly drifting back to the house, to the unseen landlord who was now, apparently, amusing itself by peeling tape off camera lenses from afar. Every buzz of my phone made me jump. I was waiting for the next violation, the next psychological jab. The feeling of being watched had transcended the physical walls of the house. It was a state of being I now carried with me everywhere. The attack came at 2:15 in the afternoon. I was in the middle of a quarterly presentation, pointing to a chart on a projector screen, when my phone, which I'd placed face down on the conference table, began to vibrate insistently. It wasn't a single buzz for a text message, but a persistent, urgent vibration. Annoyed, I glanced at the screen. It was a push notification from the Haven app, a red banner of a type I'd never seen before. Critical alert. Motion detected. Unknown person in living room. The words didn't seem real. The blood drained from my face. The voices of my colleagues faded into a dull, distant roar. Unknown person. The camera we had taped over, the one it had just cleared, had detected someone. I stammered an apology, mumbling something about a family emergency, and fled the conference room, my heart pounding. In my ears, I fumbled with my phone, my thumb slipping on the screen as I tried to open the app. The app launched, and for a terrifying second, the screen was black, with a spinning loading icon. Then, the live video feed from our living room camera snapped into view. The image was grainy, the afternoon light casting long shadows across the room, but the scene was horrifyingly clear. There, standing in the very center of our living room, between our couch and our coffee table, was a man. He was perfectly still, his back to the camera. I could see the pictures we had hung on the wall behind him, the rug we had chosen together, beneath his feet. He was a statue of pure dread placed in the heart of our life. I couldn't make out many details. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in simple dark clothing. He wasn't moving, wasn't stealing anything, wasn't looking around. He was just standing there, an impossibly calm intruder, as if he belonged in the space more than we did. My breath hitched in my throat. I was watching a live invasion of my own, home from 20 miles away, a helpless, horrified spectator, as if he could feel my gaze through the screen, as if he knew I had just opened the app. He slowly, deliberately, turned around. His face was a pale, blurry oval in the low resolution of the camera, but I could feel his eyes. He lifted his head and looked directly into the camera lens, directly at me. It was not the look of a burglar caught in the act. It was a look of calm, absolute ownership. It was piercing and possessive. It was the look of a man who knew I was on the other end of this feed watching him. He was performing for me, demonstrating his total and utter dominance over my life. He knew he could get in, and he wanted me to know it too. He wanted me to see him in our sanctuary. He held my gaze for 10 agonizing seconds, an eternity of silent, terrifying communication. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the video feed cut out. The screen went black, replaced by a single, stark message: "Feed connection lost." I frantically tapped the screen, trying to get it back, trying to access the recorded event, history. But there was nothing. The clip, the alert, all evidence of his presence. It had been remotely erased from the system. It never happened. I called Liam, but this time I wasn't screaming or crying. My voice was a dead, flat whisper. "There was a man in the house," I said, the words feeling like stones in my mouth. "I saw him, Liam. He was in the living room. There was no need for hysterics. The terror was cold and absolute now. This was no longer a ghost story or a case of cyberstalking. This was a physical home invasion. The last of our hope turned to dust. The entity was not just a voice, not just a digital phantom. It was a flesh and blood person who could bypass our locks, disable our defenses, and walk through our home at will. He could stand in our living room and stare at us through our own cameras before erasing the evidence of his presence like a god wiping a slate clean. We were not dealing with a hacker. We were dealing with a man who had built a prison around us and held every key. He could torment us remotely, and he could stand in our physical space whenever he chose. The violation was total. We were not safe when we were home, and we were not safe when we were away. There was nowhere left to run, and nowhere left to hide. The house was his. We didn't go home that night. The thought of stepping back into that house, of walking through the living room where that man had stood just hours before, was physically impossible. We met at a sterile, brightly lit coffee shop halfway between our workplaces, a small island of normalcy in a sea of madness. We sat across from each other, the coffee growing cold in our hands, replaying the single, terrifying event over and over. A man, a real man, was in our house. The image was burned into my mind. His calm posture, the way he turned to look at the camera, the absolute ownership in his gaze. He had not been afraid of being seen. He had intended it. It was a calculated move designed to shatter our last bastion of perceived safety, the physical security of our locked doors. He had proven that no lock, digital or physical, could keep him out. The ghost had finally shown us its face, and it was human. Sitting there, surrounded by the mundane chatter of strangers, the sheer scale of the violation became starkly clear. Our home, our sanctuary, had been turned into a stage for this man's private theater of terror. And as the initial shock began to wear off, something new took its place. The deep, helpless despair that had been our constant companion began to burn away, replaced by a white-hot, unifying rage, a rage that was clean and pure in its intensity. We were furious at this stranger for his unimaginable arrogance, furious at the police for their dismissiveness, at the Haven Company for its corporate impotence, at our friends for their gentle, pitying disbelief. But most of all, we were furious with ourselves for being so helpless for so long. The fear had paralyzed us, made us victims. But the image of that man in our home had shocked us back to life. A cornered animal will eventually stop cowering and bare its teeth. In that coffee shop, we made a pact. We would not run. Selling the house, abandoning our life, would be letting him win. It would be a quiet surrender, an admission that he had successfully broken us. We looked at each other, and the same desperate, wild resolve was reflected in each other's eyes. We were done being victims. We were done trying to get help from a world that refused to see the monster in our home. We were going to set a trap. When we finally returned to the house late that night, we were different people. The fear was still a coppery taste in the back of my throat, but it was no longer a paralyzing agent. It was fuel. The house no longer felt like a haunted space to be tiptoed through. It was a battlefield. We looked at the layout, the doors, the hallways, not as features of a home, but as tactical elements. Our prison was about to become our weapon. We cleared the dining room table and, in a symbolic act of defiance, spread out the original, non-digital blueprints of the house that had come with our closing documents. We were turning our back on the compromised digital world and embracing the physical. We started to think like hunters, analyzing our enemy's patterns. His greatest strength was his control of the Haven system. His greatest weakness was that he relied on it completely. He expected us to be predictable victims. We would use that arrogance against him. The next day, we went to a hardware store. We didn't browse the sleek, Wi-Fi-enabled security systems. We walked past them with contempt. Instead, we bought tools. We bought a spool of high-test fishing line, nearly invisible to the naked eye. We bought a pack of heavy-duty industrial zip ties. We bought a set of simple, battery-powered motion sensor alarms, the kind that emit a piercing, localized shriek, completely independent of any network. Our most important purchase was a simple, old-fashioned webcam. It was a basic, plug-and-play device that we would connect directly to Liam's laptop. There would be no cloud, no app, no remote access. The recording would be stored locally on the hard drive, a closed circuit that our tormentor could not access, that he could not erase. We were building our own system, an analog trap in a digital world. The plan we formulated was terrifying in its simplicity. We would give the man exactly what he wanted, an empty house. We would make a show of leaving for the weekend. We packed suitcases, loaded them into our car in plain sight of the Haven cameras we knew he was watching, and drove away. Our goal was to lull him into a sense of security, to make him believe his campaign of terror had finally driven us out. But we would only drive a few miles away, to a parking lot where we would leave the car. Then, after dark, we would return on foot. We would slip in through the back, using a key we had hidden in the yard, a key the system knew nothing about. We would become the ghosts in our own home, silent and waiting. We were no longer trying to keep him out. We were inviting him in. The fear of this final confrontation was immense, but the fear of living one more day as his puppets was greater. We had been pushed past our breaking point. We had abandoned all hope of a reasonable solution, of a return to the normal life we once knew. We had accepted the madness of our situation, and we were ready to meet our tormentor on his own terms. We were turning his own tactics of surveillance and surprise against him. We were using ourselves, our home, and our feigned defeat as the bait. As we drove away from our house that Friday afternoon, I looked back at it, so peaceful and perfect on its quiet street. It looked like a dream, but I knew it was a stage, and we were just setting it for the final, terrible act. We were no longer fighting for our peace of mind. We were fighting for our lives. We sat in the car in a desolate corner of a supermarket parking lot, 3 miles from our house. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple that felt mocking in their beauty. The tension inside the car was a physical thing, a thick, unbreathable atmosphere. Every passing car on the distant road made us jump. We had willingly abandoned our home, leaving it empty and waiting, a baited trap. Now, all we could do was wait for the cover of darkness to become ghosts, ourselves. "This is insane," I whispered for what must have been the 100th time, my gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. We're hiding in a parking lot, waiting to break into our own house to trap a man who might not even show up. Liam didn't look away from his laptop screen, which cast a pale blue light on his grim face. "He'll show up, Maya," he said, his voice low and certain. "He can't stay away. The house is his obsession. We just have to be patient." While we waited, Liam wasn't idle. The waiting was part of the plan, a necessary buffer, but he was using the time to dig. We had one crucial piece of information we had overlooked in our panic: the name of the man who had sold us the house. It was right there on the closing documents we had stored in the cloud: Arthur Vance. Until now, he had just been a name on a legal form. Now, he was the primary target of our investigation. We were finally learning the name of our ghost. Liam's fingers flew across the keyboard, his face illuminated by the screen. He began cross-referencing the name with our address, with public records, with any digital breadcrumb he could find. The initial search results were sparse. Arthur Vance had almost no digital footprint. There was no social media presence, no smiling photos on Facebook or professional networking on LinkedIn. He was a ghost online, a man who had intentionally erased himself from the public-facing internet. This in itself was a chilling affirmation. Then Liam found something. A professional bio on the website for a high-end boutique tech firm that specialized in closed network security. Arthur Vance had been a senior systems architect there. His specialty was listed as persistent offline data architecture and encrypted local networks. The description sent a shiver down my spine. He didn't just use systems like Haven. He was the kind of man who designed them. He knew their every strength and, more importantly, their every exploitable weakness. He kept digging, and then he found it. An old article from a local news archive, dated 5 years ago. The headline was stark: "Tragedy on quiet suburban street." I leaned over, my eyes scanning the text on the screen, my blood slowly turning to ice as I read the address. It was our address, our house. The article detailed a catastrophic furnace malfunction, a silent, deadly carbon monoxide leak in the middle of the night. The victims were listed: Elena Vance, age 36, and Lily Vance, age 6. Arthur Vance's wife and daughter. They had died in their sleep in what was now our master bedroom. The article mentioned that Arthur himself had been away on an international business trip at the time. He had left a husband and father, and returned a widower, a man whose entire family had been extinguished by the silent failure of the very house he lived in. Suddenly, everything clicked into place with a horrifying, sickening clarity. The sad, melancholy piano lullaby. It wasn't just random music. It must have been Lily's. The oppressive, sorrowful atmosphere we sometimes felt from the house wasn't a product of our imagination. It was the digital echo of his unbearable grief. The house wasn't just a piece of property he had sold. It was a tomb. It was a memorial to his lost family, a place he was pathologically unable to let go of. He had built this digital fortress, the Haven system, perhaps to protect his family, to give them a perfect, safe world. And it had failed them. The technology he trusted had been useless against a simple mechanical failure. Now, his creation was a tool to preserve his grief, to keep the house in a state of perpetual mourning. We weren't just homeowners to him. We were intruders. We were desecrating his sacred space with our laughter, our plans, our happiness, our life. This new knowledge recontextualized everything. He wasn't just a malicious, anonymous stalker. He was a man shattered by loss, driven by a profound and delusional obsession. But this didn't make him less scary. It made him infinitely more so. A simple criminal might be deterred. A man acting out of a bottomless well of grief. A man who believes he is the rightful guardian of his family's tomb. He would be relentless. He would be unstoppable. His torment was not random. It was a twisted form of gatekeeping. The cold temperatures, the sad music, the constant watching. He was trying to make the house as cold and as sad as his own heart. He was trying to force us out, not just for his own sake, but perhaps, in his broken mind, for theirs. He was keeping the house quiet for his sleeping family. Armed with this devastating understanding, we knew there was no turning back. This was no longer about a simple intrusion. It was about a man who had woven his own personal hell into the fabric of a home, and was now dragging us into it. The fight felt heavier now, freighted with the weight of his tragedy and his madness. As true darkness finally fell, we killed the laptop screen, plunging the car into blackness. We got out, the air cool and crisp against our faces. We began our silent walk back towards our neighborhood, back towards our house. We were no longer just walking toward a trap for an unknown enemy. We were walking toward a confrontation with Arthur Vance, the grieving specter who refused to abandon his post. The house sat dark and silent ahead of us, and for the first time, we understood the true nature of the ghost that haunted its halls. We moved through the darkness of our own neighborhood like spies, sticking to the shadows, our footsteps silent on the damp grass of our neighbors' lawns. The house loomed before us, a dark, silent silhouette against the moonless sky. Knowing, the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls changed its very shape. It now looked like a monument to grief, and we felt like grave robbers approaching a sacred tomb. Our anger had not vanished, but it was now tempered with a heavy, sorrowful dread. We were not just trapping a criminal, we were confronting a ghost, made of flesh and blood. The spare key was cold against my palm. Liam stood watch as I quietly unlocked the back door, the click of the tumbler sounding deafeningly loud in the night. We slipped inside, closing the door gently behind us. The air in the house was stale and cold. Being here now, as intruders, felt profoundly strange. We were seeing our home through his eyes, a dark, quiet space to be navigated with stealth. Every familiar shape, a chair, a lamp, a table, was a strange and menacing obstacle in the gloom. We worked in perfect, rehearsed silence. We placed the small, battery-powered motion sensors at the front and back doors. We set up the cheap webcam on a bookshelf, aimed at the center of the living room, its cord snaking back to Liam's laptop. We had one chance to capture undeniable proof. Our hiding spot was a deep coat closet under the stairs, a dark, cramped space that smelled of old wood and winter coats. We huddled inside, leaving the door ajar just a crack, and began our vigil. The waiting was the hardest part. Trapped in the darkness, every second stretched into an eternity. The normal sounds of the house were amplified, each groan of the pipes, or settling of the foundation a potential footstep. Doubt began to fester in the quiet. Had we been too obvious? Did he somehow know we were here, watching us from inside the walls with his own hidden cameras? My carefully constructed resolve began to fray, replaced by the familiar gnawing fear. Just as I began to think it was a bust, that he wasn't coming, a soft chirp came from the motion sensor at the back door. My heart leaped into my throat. Liam, and I exchanged a wide-eyed look in the darkness. He was here. We heard the sound we were waiting for, the soft electronic click of the Haven smart lock on the back door disengaging. He hadn't even bothered to try the handle. He had just unlocked it from wherever he was, a final, arrogant display of his control. The door swung open, and we heard the soft tread of his footsteps in the kitchen. They were slow, unhurried, confident. These were not the movements of a burglar. They were the steps of a man returning to his own home. He walked from the kitchen into the dining room, a tall, thin silhouette passing through the faint moonlight. He was moving towards the living room, towards the view of our hidden camera. Liam opened his laptop, the screen illuminating our tiny space, and the grainy black and white feed appeared. There he was, Arthur Vance. He stood in the center of our living room, a ghostly figure in the dark. He wasn't looking around. He was just standing there, as if absorbing the atmosphere, breathing, in the essence of the space. Then he spoke, his voice a low, heartbroken whisper that the webcam's tiny microphone barely picked up. "I'm home," he whispered to the empty room. "I'm home, Lily." That was our signal. Liam hit a key on his laptop, activating a smart plug we had placed on a large lamp, the one device we had left connected. The living room was instantly flooded with harsh, bright light. At the same time, Liam's phone, connected to a Bluetooth speaker we had hidden, began to shriek, playing a piercing, deafening alarm tone. The effect was instantaneous. Arthur flinched back, stunned by the sudden assault of light and sound. We burst out of the closet, our own yells adding to the cacophony. "Get out!" Liam roared, his voice shaking with adrenaline and rage. "Get out of our house!" Arthur spun to face us, and for a brief moment, I saw his face clearly. It was gaunt, haunted, his eyes wide, not with the fear of being caught, but with a profound, sorrowful confusion. He looked at us as if we were the intruders, the unexpected ghosts in his private sanctuary. He didn't lunge at us. He didn't say a word. He just stared at me, and in his eyes I saw a bottomless well of pain. He took one stumbling step towards me, his hand slightly raised, not in aggression, but in a gesture that looked disturbingly like pleading. The alarm was still shrieking, the light was still flashing. The chaos had broken his composure. He was just a man, a broken, trespassing man. The moment shattered. The confusion in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of panicked awareness. He turned and fled. But he didn't run for the door. He ran towards the darkest corner of the house, towards a wall in the downstairs hallway. In a move so fluid it seemed impossible. He seemed to melt into the shadows, and was simply gone. He knew a way out that we didn't. A secret passage hidden in the bones of the house. By the time the police arrived, summoned by my frantic 911 call, he had vanished. We sold the house. We took a loss, desperate to escape the digital and emotional residue of Arthur Vance. The police report was inconclusive, citing a possible vagrant, but our webcam footage, grainy as it was, at least proved we hadn't been imagining things. We never heard from Arthur again. There were no new reports, no arrests. He had faded back into the digital ether from whence he came. We live in an apartment. Now, a small, stupid apartment with dumb locks and simple light switches. We have no digital assistants, no smart devices. I cover the camera on my laptop with a piece of tape, and I am wary of any technology that promises convenience. We survived, but the victory feels hollow. We won back our lives, but we lost our sense of security forever. The Haven system is gone, but the scars remain. Sometimes, late at night, when the city is quiet, I think I can still hear the faint, sad melody of a piano lullaby on the wind. I am haunted by the ghost of a man who was himself haunted. A man who built a perfect, intelligent home that couldn't save his family. And I am left with the chilling, permanent knowledge that in our modern world, the deepest, most persistent ghosts are not the ones in the graveyard. They are the ones with the master account.